Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through darkness and light. Tonight, we'll travel together through the events of spring 1986, exploring the quiet town of Hawkins, Indiana, and the extraordinary challenges faced by those who call it home. As you settle into your comfortable space, let the gentle flow of this story carry you into peaceful dreams. But before you do, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really does help support me. So let's begin with the shadows gathering in Hawkins. In the spring of 1986, 6 months had passed since the Battle of Starcourt. Hawkins, Indiana appeared to have returned to normal life, though those who knew the truth understood that darkness still lingered beneath the surface. The mall fire, as the town remembered it, had claimed 30 lives and left scars both visible and hidden. For the young people who had fought that night, the aftermath brought not closure, but separation. The Byers family had relocated to Lenora Hills, California, seeking distance from tragedy. Joyce worked multiple jobs, attempting to provide stability for her sons, while carrying grief for the man she believed dead. Jonathan, now attending community college, struggled with the weight of adult responsibilities, arriving too early. Will, beginning high school in an unfamiliar place, felt the lingering connection to a dimension he desperately wished to forget. 11, living with the Byers under the name Jane Hopper, faced perhaps the most challenging transition of all. Without her powers, 11 navigated the ordinary complexities of teenage life. With none of the extraordinary abilities that had defined her existence, high school in California proved far more treacherous than battling monsters. Angela and her friends, sensing something different about the quiet girl, with the shaved hair growing out unevenly, made 11 their primary target. The casual cruelty of adolescent social hierarchies created wounds no telekinetic power could have prevented. She attended classes, attempted to make friends, and wrote letters to Mike Wheeler in Hawkins, carefully constructing a version of her life that seemed happier than reality. In Hawkins itself, the remaining group had entered high school with their own challenges. Mike, Dustin, and Lucas faced the complex social navigation that came with being freshmen. The rigid hierarchies of Hawkins High sorted students into categories, and the three friends found themselves occupying uncertain territory. Lucas, recruited for the basketball team due to genuine athletic talent, discovered the appeal of popularity and normalcy. His girlfriend Max, however, had withdrawn into herself, isolating from everyone who cared about her. Max Mayfield's grief over Billy's death consumed her in ways that worried her friends, but that she refused to discuss. She visited his grave regularly, played her Walkman constantly, and avoided meaningful connection with determination. The guilt she carried, the complicated love for a stepbrother who had been both cruel and ultimately heroic, created a burden too heavy to share. Her mother, struggling with alcoholism and her own unprocessed loss, provided little support. Max existed in a state of functional depression, attending school, maintaining minimum academic standards, but truly present nowhere. Steve Harrington and Robin Buckley had graduated and entered the working world at Family Video, a job that suited their friendship's dynamic perfectly. Steve's transformation from popular athlete to responsible older brother figure was complete. He drove the younger kids to school, provided advice, and demonstrated patience that would have shocked his teenage self. Robin, brilliant and anxious, found in Steve an unexpected best friend whose acceptance allowed her to be fully herself. Their shifts together involved extensive movie discussions, customer service challenges, and the comfortable rhythm of platonic soulmates. Nancy Wheeler, now a senior, had applied to several prestigious colleges while maintaining her relationship with Jonathan through letters and occasional expensive phone calls. The distance between them created strain neither fully acknowledged. Nancy's journalism aspirations continued to develop through her work on the school paper, while Jonathan's photography provided his own creative outlet. However, the practical realities of separated lives slowly eroded what had once seemed unshakable. Neither admitted the growing gulf, instead writing letters full of reassurances that felt increasingly hollow. The adult generation carried their own burdens. Joyce's multiple jobs barely covered expenses, leaving her exhausted and unable to provide the emotional support her children needed. She dated no one, Jim Hopper's presumed death having closed that door permanently in her mind. Murray Bauman, having returned from Russia via complex routes, maintained his paranoid isolation while keeping contact with Joyce. His knowledge of what truly happened created loneliness, even among those who knew the truth. The shadow that had created this separation, however, existed beyond their awareness. The upside down, that parallel dimension of decay and horror, had not disappeared with the Mind Flayer's defeat. Instead, it waited, patient and purposeful. The consciousness controlling it had been injured but not destroyed. Time in that realm moved differently, allowing wounds to heal and plans to form without the interference of linear progression. The entity that would come to be called Vecna prepared methodically, selecting targets with care and malice. The history of the Upside Down stretched back further than any of the young heroes understood. When 11 had opened the first gate in 1983, she had connected two dimensions that were meant to remain separate. That gate, though closed, had established a link that could never be completely severed. The Mind Flayer's subsequent attempts to invade Hawkins, to possess Will, and then Billy represented a consciousness seeking entry into a world it wished to remake. But the Mind Flayer itself was not the origin of that consciousness. In 1979, something had happened at Hawkins National Laboratory that shaped everything that followed. Dr. Martin Brenner's experiments with psychic children had produced numerous test subjects, each numbered and trained in various applications of their powers. These children, stolen or purchased from desperate families, lived in a facility that pretended at benevolence while practicing systematic abuse. Among them, one stood apart in both power and pathology. The child known as One possessed abilities that exceeded all others. He could kill with his mind, reshape matter, and perceive thoughts with invasive clarity. Brenner, recognizing both the potential and danger, had attempted to control him through a chip implanted in his neck, a device that suppressed his powers while keeping him compliant. For years this containment held, with One serving as an orderly in the lab, watching younger children develop the abilities he had been forced to restrain. His resentment grew silently, patiently, until opportunity arrived in the form of a particularly powerful young girl. 11, subject 011, had been raised in the laboratory from infancy. She knew no other life, no other family, beyond the cold institutional structure Brenner imposed. Her powers developed under careful observation, her potential recognized even in early childhood. When One approached her, presenting himself as an ally against their common oppressor, she believed his offer of friendship. The manipulation was careful, gradual, building trust before revealing the deeper plan. On September 8, 1979, One convinced 11 to remove his suppressor chip. The moment his powers returned, he unleashed years of accumulated rage upon the laboratory. The massacre that followed claimed nearly every person in the facility. Children, scientists, guards, all fell to One's psychic assault. He moved through the building systematically, breaking bodies and minds with equal ease. His philosophy, expressed to a horrified 11, revealed a worldview that saw human civilization as a disease requiring cure. He believed that societal rules and emotional bonds weakened humanity, that only through liberation from such constraints could people achieve their true potential. 11, witnessing the slaughter of children she had known since infancy, recognized the horror of what she had enabled. Despite One's greater experience and arguably greater raw power, her emotional connection to those dying around her provided strength he could not match. The battle between them tore through the laboratory, a conflict of psychic forces that left walls cracked and equipment destroyed. In the final desperate moment, 11 summoned every reserve of power and cast one through a gateway, banishing him to another dimension entirely. The dimension she inadvertently created, or perhaps accessed, became the Upside Down. One, falling through impossible space, landed in a realm that mirrored Hawkins, but existed in a state of perpetual decay and darkness. The journey and the impact transformed him physically, his body twisting into something monstrous. Vines grew into his flesh, his skin became pallid and scarred, his humanity burned away by the dimension's corruption. He became Vecna, named by children who would one day face him for a character in a fantasy game. The Upside Down itself took shape in that moment, November 6, 1983, when 11 opened the first gate while searching for a Russian agent through psychic projection. The dimension froze in time on that specific date, capturing Hawkins as it existed in that instant and preserving it in amber of rot and shadow. Every building, every tree, every object existed in its November 6, 1983 configuration, unchanging regardless of how the real Hawkins evolved. This temporal snapshot would later prove significant, a clue to the Upside Down's true nature. Vecna spent years in this realm, his injuries healing, his powers adapting to the dimension's unique properties. He discovered the Mind Flayer, or perhaps created it, a vast consciousness that shared his desire to consume and reshape the world above. The relationship between them remained unclear, whether Vecna controlled the Mind Flayer or they existed in symbiosis. What was certain was that every attack on Hawkins, since 1983, traced back to this single source, this one consciousness bent on revenge and reformation. The opening of subsequent gates, Will's possession, the tunnel system beneath Hawkins, the transformation of Billy Hargrove, all represented Vecna's attempts to establish a permanent connection between dimensions. Each effort had been thwarted by the group of young people whose lives he had inadvertently shaped. Their victories, however, came without understanding the true nature of their enemy. They fought symptoms without recognizing the disease, defeating manifestations while the source remained hidden and healing. Now in March 1986, Vecna had recovered sufficiently to attempt a new strategy. Rather than possession or physical invasion, he would tear open permanent gates through murder itself. The dimension's rules, which he understood more completely than any human could, allowed for specific types of death to weaken the barrier between worlds. Trauma provided the key. Individuals carrying sufficient guilt, grief, or psychological damage became vulnerable to his particular form of attack. By invading their minds, forcing them to confront their darkest memories, and ultimately breaking their bodies, he could create rifts in reality itself. The plan required 4 such deaths, 4 sacrifices to open 4 gates that would converge on a single point. The pattern would form an X through Hawkins, tearing the town apart, while simultaneously merging it with the Upside Down. Once the dimensions overlapped sufficiently, his army of creatures could pour through without resistance. The Mind Flayer's vast form could manifest fully. The takeover would be complete, and from this beachhead, the corruption could spread across the entire world. His first victims would be carefully selected. Chrissy Cunningham, the seemingly perfect cheerleader hiding depression and eating disorders behind a bright smile. Fred Benson, the school journalist carrying guilt over a car accident that had killed another teenager. Patrick McKinney, the basketball player whose home life concealed abuse and fear. And Max Mayfield, drowning in grief and guilt over her stepbrother's death. Each suffered from trauma that made them vulnerable. Each carried darkness that Vecna could exploit. The stage was set for events that would test not just individual courage, but the very bonds holding the group together. Separation had weakened them. distance creating vulnerabilities that unified presence had previously prevented. The scattered nature of their current existence, with some in California, one presumed dead in Russia, and others in Hawkins navigating different social circles, meant that response to crisis would be fragmented and delayed. Vecna had chosen his moment well, striking when those who had repeatedly defeated his plans were at their most divided and vulnerable. As March deepened and spring break approached, Hawkins appeared peaceful. Students attended classes, worked part-time jobs, and planned for the coming break. The basketball team practiced for the championship game. Chrissy Cunningham maintained her cheerful facade despite the nightmares keeping her awake. Eddie Munson prepared the next Hellfire Club campaign, unaware that his life was about to become far stranger than any Dungeon Master scenario. Max isolated herself further, pushing away the friends who wanted to help. In California, Mike Wheeler counted days until he could visit 11, unaware of how much she was struggling. Will sensed something wrong through his connection to the Upside Down, but dismissed it as residual trauma. Jonathan dealt with his own challenges, including the growing realization that his relationship with Nancy might not survive distance and different life directions. 11 prepared for Mike's visit while hiding her school struggles, desperate to seem normal and happy despite feeling neither. In Russia, in a prison camp called Kamchatka, a man who should have been dead fought to survive each day. Jim Hopper, captured by Soviet forces during the Battle of Starcourt, endured conditions designed to break both body and spirit. His fellow prisoners died regularly, either from labour, cold, or the demogorgon the Soviets kept for purposes Hopper could not fathom. His friendship with a guard named Dmitri, called Enzo, provided his only hope of escape and his only connection to a world beyond barbed wire and frozen wasteland. Together, they planned an escape attempt that seemed impossible, but represented the only alternative to death. The convergence of these separate stories approached inevitably. Events set in motion years ago by a young girl defeating a monster, by a government conspiracy opening dimensions, by individual choices to be courageous or cowardly, all moved toward a point of crisis. The spring of 1986 would determine not just whether Hawkins survived, but whether the victory won at such cost over previous years would prove temporary or lasting. The shadows gathering in Hawkins were about to step into light, and those who had thought themselves safe would discover that distance provided no protection from enemies who could invade through the mind itself. The unfolding crisis revealed itself not in a single moment, but across 3 distant locations, each holding pieces of a puzzle. No one yet understood they were solving together. The fragmentation that had protected the group in previous conflicts now became their greatest vulnerability. Communication across state lines and international borders proved too slow for the rapidly developing threat. Each location operated in near isolation, responding to local manifestations of a single underlying danger. In Hawkins, the first victim fell on Friday, March 21st, 1986, transforming what had seemed like a normal spring day into something far darker. Chrissy Cunningham, head cheerleader and girlfriend to basketball star Jason Carver, had been struggling with demons invisible to those around her. Her mother's controlling behaviour, particularly around food and appearance, had created an eating disorder Chrissy desperately hid. The pressure to maintain perfection in every aspect of her life had become unbearable. Sleep eluded her as nightmares grew increasingly vivid and disturbing. The visions began subtly, a clock chiming when no clock was present, her mother's face twisting into something monstrous, spiders crawling from impossibly dark spaces. These hallucinations, which Chrissy tried to attribute to exhaustion or stress, were actually the first symptoms of Vecna's curse. He had selected her carefully, recognizing the psychological trauma beneath her cheerful exterior, the guilt she felt over not being the daughter her mother demanded, the self-loathing created by disordered eating, the fear that she was fundamentally broken, all provided entry points for his invasion of her mind. Desperate for relief, Chrissy had approached Eddie Munson in the school parking lot. Eddie, leader of the Hellfire Club, and Hawkins High's resident metalhead, dealt marijuana to supplement his meagre income. The two moved in completely different social circles, but desperation made Chrissy willing to cross those boundaries. Eddie, surprised but sympathetic, agreed to meet her at his trailer after school to provide something stronger than marijuana, something that might help her sleep. The meeting at Eddie's trailer park residence seemed routine initially. Eddie's uncle Wayne worked nights, leaving the small home empty. During the late afternoon, Chrissy followed Eddie inside, nervous but committed to finding any solution to her escalating torment. Eddie searched for the promised drugs, making awkward small talk to ease the tension. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Chrissy froze, her eyes rolling back, her body rigid in a standing position. Eddie, turning from his search to find her catatonic, initially thought she was having a seizure. He spoke her name, touched her arm, tried desperately to wake her from whatever had seized her. His confusion transformed into terror as her body began to lift from the ground, levitating in defiance of physics. The lights flickered, the trailer shook, and then in a moment of horror that would haunt Eddie for the brief time he had left, Chrissy Cunningham's body shattered. Her bones broke simultaneously, limbs twisting at impossible angles. Her eyes were destroyed, blood flowing from the empty sockets. The sounds of her death, the breaking and tearing, filled the small space. Then her body dropped to the floor, a broken arrangement of flesh that no longer resembled the cheerful teenager who had knocked on his door minutes earlier. Eddie, processing what he had witnessed, made the decision that would seal his fate. He ran. The discovery of Chrissy's body brought immediate police response. The brutality of the death, combined with the location in Eddie Munson's trailer, created obvious suspect. The town's existing prejudice against Eddie, the known drug dealer and dungeon master, for a game many parents feared as satanic, made it easy to construct a narrative of drug deal gone wrong, followed by occult murder. The fact that Eddie had fled rather than reporting the death confirmed his guilt in the minds of law enforcement and the community. Jason Carver, devastated by his girlfriend's death and enraged by the circumstances, immediately assumed Eddie's guilt. His grief transformed into a mission to find Eddie and deliver what he saw as justice. The basketball team, united in their loyalty to Jason, became an impromptu vigilante group. They began searching for Eddie, questioning anyone who might know his whereabouts, and spreading their certainty about his culpability throughout the school and town. The atmosphere grew toxic quickly, with accusations of satanic cult activity and ritualistic murder gaining traction among those predisposed to believe such things. Meanwhile, Dustin Henderson had received a frantic call from Eddie before he went into hiding. Eddie, knowing he would be blamed, had called the one person in Hawkins he thought might believe his innocence. Dustin, having faced the genuinely impossible multiple times, recognized that something supernatural had occurred. He immediately contacted the rest of the party, bringing Max and Steve into the investigation. Robin joined through her friendship with Steve, and Lucas found himself torn between his basketball team loyalty and his friend's certainty that Eddie was innocent. The investigation began with finding Eddie. Dustin, knowing his friend's habits and hideouts, eventually located him at Reefer Rick's lake house, a dealer's property currently unoccupied due to Rick's incarceration. Eddie, hungry, terrified, and sleeping in a boat covered by tarp, emerged to Dustin's calls with suspicion. The reunion, emotional despite the circumstances, allowed Eddie to provide his account of what he had witnessed. The description matched nothing from the mundane world, but fit perfectly into the pattern of upside-down related phenomena. The group's research led them to discover that Chrissy was not an isolated incident. Fred Benson, another Hawkins High student, had disappeared and been found dead the next day near the trailer park. His death replicated Chrissy's in its violence and impossibility. The presence of two victims with similar death patterns suggested a serial element, though the supernatural nature differentiated this from typical criminal activity. Max, investigating on her own, discovered that both victims had been seeing the same symptoms before death: headaches, nosebleeds, nightmares, and visions of a clock. Nancy Wheeler and Robin Buckley partnered to investigate the historical angle. Research in the Hawkins Public Library led them to the Victor Creel case, a family tragedy from 1959 that bore disturbing similarities to current events. The Creel family had died in their home on Moorhead Street, all except Victor himself and one child. Victor, committed to Penhurst Asylum, had spent decades claiming a demon killed his family. The newspapers had dismissed his claims as the ravings of a murderer in denial. However, the description of events, particularly the breaking of bones and destruction of eyes, matched exactly what was happening now. Nancy and Robin travelled to Penhurst to interview Victor Creel. The asylum, a grim institution that warehoused the mentally ill rather than treating them, kept Victor in conditions that bordered on torture. The interview, conducted through bribery and deception, revealed Victor's account of that night in 1959. He described a malevolent presence attacking his family one by one, unable to stop the demon that had invaded his home. His daughter Alice died first, her bones breaking in her bed. His wife Virginia followed, killed in the same brutal fashion. Only his son Henry survived, and Victor was uncertain how. The revelation that Henry Creel survived became crucial to understanding the current threat. Research into what happened to the boy proved difficult, as his records had been sealed or destroyed. However, the group pieced together enough to understand that something about Henry Creel connected to their present crisis. The house on Moorhead Street still stood, abandoned and rumoured to be cursed. The group's investigation would eventually lead them there, into a structure that existed in both dimensions, a place where the barrier between worlds had worn thin through. Decades of dark history. Max, conducting her own investigation through visits to the school counsellor's office, discovered records of students reporting the same symptoms that had preceded Chrissy and Fred's deaths. She recognised her own symptoms in the descriptions. The headaches she had attributed to stress, the nightmares she dismissed as grief processing, the hallucinations she told herself were exhaustion-induced, all fit the pattern. She was next. The realisation came with certainty and strange calm. Max had been courting death through isolation and neglect of her own well-being since Billy died. Part of her, the part drowning in guilt over her relief at his death mixed with grief at losing him, perhaps wanted the end. However, seeing the pattern laid out, understanding that something was hunting her specifically, activated a survival instinct she thought had atrophied. She gathered her friends, revealed what she had learned, and played them a cassette tape. The music that had been her constant companion since Billy's death. Kate Bush's Running Up That Hill had interrupted one of her visions. In the cemetery, standing at Billy's grave, she had entered the trance state that preceded death. The vision showed her stepbrother, broken and accusing. Then the song began, her Walkman activating at exactly the right moment, and the vision shattered. She returned to consciousness with the understanding that music provided protection, a lifeline back to reality when the curse pulled her toward death. The group tested this theory immediately. Max, equipped with her Walkman and headphones, deliberately allowed herself to enter the cursed state, while surrounded by friends, ready to play her music if needed. The vision took her to the Creel house, though she had never been inside the actual structure. The architecture matched, but the version she experienced existed in decay and shadow, clearly the upside-down's mirror of Hawkins. There in the attic, she encountered the entity hunting her. Vecna revealed himself for the first time, a creature that had once been human but now barely resembled one. His voice, when he spoke, carried both Henry Creel and something older, darker. He showed her visions of Billy's death, forced her to confront every moment of guilt and grief she carried. He explained with the certainty of someone sharing truth rather than threatening that she would die. Her death would be the third, bringing him closer to the four he needed. The conversation might have continued, but Max's friends, watching her catatonic form in panic, played her song. Running up that hill pulled Max from the upside down with violent force. She woke gasping, certain she had been seconds from death. The encounter provided crucial information despite its trauma. Vecna needed 4 specific deaths to achieve his goal. Victims had to carry sufficient psychological damage to make them vulnerable to his psychic invasion. Music, representing positive memories, and emotional connections could disrupt his control by providing an anchor to the living world. Time was limited, but not exhausted. They could still fight. While Hawkins dealt with supernatural murder, California faced its own crisis of a different nature. 11's struggle to adapt to normal life had reached a breaking point during Mike Wheeler's spring break visit. Mike had arrived with expectations of reuniting with his girlfriend after months of separation. The reality of 11's situation, carefully hidden in her letters, became impossible to conceal in person. The bullying 11 endured at school had been ongoing since her arrival. Angela, the ringleader, had identified 11 as an easy target. The strange girl who dressed differently, spoke oddly, and seemed to understand social cues only imperfectly became the focus of elaborate schemes designed to humiliate and isolate her. 11, having faced demogorgons and the Mind Flayer, found herself helpless against teenage cruelty. She had no powers to defend herself, no way to make them stop beyond enduring. Mike's visit brought these tensions to a head at Rinkomania, a roller skating rink where Angela orchestrated a public humiliation. She had convinced 11 that they were friends, created an elaborate setup to make the humiliation more complete. When Angela revealed the deception in front of the entire rink, including Mike and Will, 11's control broke. She struck Angela with a roller skate, causing injury that would bring police involvement. The action was out of character, but understandable, the culmination of months of abuse meeting a breaking point. The consequences arrived swiftly. Before 11 could fully process what she had done, before Mike and Will could help her understand or escape, armed forces raided the Wheeler Buyers group at their makeshift picnic. Military personnel arrested 11 despite Mike and Will's protests. Dr. Sam Owens, the government agent who had tried to protect 11 in the past, was behind the detention. However, his motives were more complex than simple punishment. Owens revealed a plan to restore 11's powers through something called the Nina Project. Located in a secret facility in Nevada, the program would use a sensory deprivation tank and psychological techniques to help 11 access her abilities again. The urgency came from Owens' awareness of increasing upside-down activity. Though his information was incomplete, he believed 11 represented humanity's best defense against dimensional threats, and her current powerless state left the world vulnerable. 11's reaction to learning Dr. Martin Brenner was alive and involved in the Nina Project created complex emotions. Brenner, the man who had raised her, abused her, and claimed to love her while treating her as an experiment, represented everything she'd tried to escape. His survival of the Season 1 Demogorgon attack had been concealed, his recovery taking place in secret. Government facilities. His involvement in restoring her powers felt like a betrayal by Owens, who knew Brenner's history of exploitation. The Nina Project itself took place in an underground facility in the Nevada desert. The technology, advanced beyond conventional understanding, allowed 11 to relive specific memories with sensory completeness. The goal was to help her access the emotional and psychological states that had originally manifested her abilities. This meant confronting her most traumatic memories, particularly the events of September 8, 1979, when the Hawkins Lab massacre had occurred. Through multiple sessions in the tank, 11 gradually remembered details she had suppressed or forgotten. The friendship between her and one, the orderly who had been kind when others were cruel, his manipulation of her into removing his power-suppressing chip, the massacre that followed, with one systematically killing every person in the facility except her. The revelation that she had not caused the massacre, that the blood she had found herself covered in belonged to one's victims, rather than hers, provided psychological relief, even as it revealed deeper horror. The memory of her battle with one, now fully accessible, showed her younger self achieving victory through desperation rather than superior skill. She had accessed powers she did not know she possessed, driven by the need to stop one from killing her. The act of banishing him to the Upside Down had opened the first connection between dimensions, though at the time she'd not understood what she was doing. The cost of that victory, the complete depletion of her powers followed by memory suppression, made sense in retrospect. As Eleven's powers slowly returned through this painful process of remembering, military forces not aligned with Owen's converged on the facility. Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan, leading a faction that saw 11 as a threat rather than an asset, ordered an assault to eliminate her. The attack came while 11 remained in a vulnerable state, her powers returning, but not yet stable. Owens, working with guards loyal to him, managed to extract 11 during the chaos. However, Brenner, suffering fatal wounds in the attack, used his last moments to delay 11's escape, seeking forgiveness or connection until the very end. 11, fleeing with Owens through the desert, eventually reached a pizza restaurant where they took shelter. Owens arranged for supplies and transportation, while 11 processed everything she had remembered and lost. Her powers had returned, though not at full strength, requiring rest and recovery. Meanwhile, Mike, Will, Jonathan, and their friend Argyle from California, having learned of 11's situation through their own investigation, were making their way to Nevada to help. In Russia, the third branch of this scattered crisis unfolded. Joyce Byers had received a package marked from the Soviet Union containing a doll and a cryptic message, suggesting Hopper was alive. Despite the implausibility, despite the 6 months of mourning, Joyce recognized something in the message that made her believe. She recruited Murray Bauman, whose Russian language skills and intelligence connections made him the ideal partner for an impossible rescue mission. The journey to Russia proved as complicated as expected. Joyce and Murray flew to Alaska, where they were to meet a contact named Yuri, who would smuggle them into the Soviet Union and help locate Hopper. Yuri, a pilot and smuggler whose criminal enterprise relied on regular border crossings, seemed eager to help for the right price. However, his motivations were more complicated than simple financial gain. He had been offered substantially more money to deliver Joyce and Murray as prisoners than he would receive for helping them. The betrayal happened mid-flight. Rather than landing where promised, Yuri diverted to a remote location where Soviet forces waited. Joyce and Murray, realizing too late what was happening, fought back, but were ultimately captured. Their journey to the Kamchatka prison camp took days, giving them time to understand the scope of their mistake, while offering no opportunity for escape. The frozen Russian landscape, harsh and unforgiving, made clear that survival outside the prison would be nearly impossible, even if they managed to break free. Kamchatka itself operated as both labor camp and experimental facility. Prisoners worked in brutal conditions, mining or performing other tasks until death claimed them. The guards maintained order through violence and the ever-present threat of the Demogorgon. The Soviets, having captured one of the creatures during their Starcourt operation, kept it for purposes that remained unclear. Periodically, prisoners would be selected to fight the Demogorgon in an arena, providing entertainment for guards and officers. No prisoner had ever survived such an encounter. Hopper's survival had been improbable from the beginning. Captured during the explosion that supposedly killed him, Injured but alive, he had been transported to Russia for interrogation about American knowledge of the Upside Down. His refusal to cooperate, combined with his physical resilience, had kept him alive when others died. His friendship with a guard named Dmitri, known as Enzo, provided his only source of human connection and his only hope for escape. Dmitri's motivations for helping Hopper stemmed from his own family situation. He had a wife and son outside the prison, and the money from facilitating an American's escape would allow them to leave Russia for a better life. The risk was enormous, but the reward justified it. Together, Hopper and Dmitri had planned the message to Joyce, the delivery method designed to avoid detection while providing proof of life. The plan required Yuri's cooperation, but Yuri's betrayal had complicated everything. Joyce and Murray's arrival at the prison, however, inadvertently created new opportunities. Dmitri's plan adapted to include all three Americans escaping together. The complexity increased, but so did the available resources and skills. Murray's intelligence background and combat training, combined with Joyce's determined resourcefulness, added capabilities that hadn't existed when only Hopper needed extraction. The escape attempt would require timing, luck, and a willingness to confront the demogorgon that stood between them and freedom. The separate investigations across three locations proceeded without knowledge of each other's progress. In Hawkins, the group worked to understand Vecna and protect Max while proving Eddie's innocence. In California and Nevada, Eleven's return to power moved forward through painful confrontation with suppressed memories. In Russia, an impossible rescue mission prepared to challenge both human and monster obstacles. Each group operated in isolation, yet their actions would converge toward a single moment of crisis. The fragmentation that had weakened them would need to transform into coordinated action despite the distances and barriers between them. The connections between these three struggles existed in ways none of the participants yet understood. Vecna's attacks on Hawkins, while appearing independent, related directly to Eleven's powerless state. He had waited for exactly this moment, when his nemesis could not sense or interfere with his plans. The timing was not coincidental, but carefully planned. The Mind Flayer's presence in Russia, manifested through the captive Demogorgon, represented another piece of the same puzzle. The hive-mind connection meant that weakening Vecna in Hawkins could affect creatures thousands of miles away. As March progressed toward its final week, the various threads began pulling tighter. In Hawkins, Max's acceptance of her role as bait in a trap for Vecna moved forward. In Nevada, Eleven's recovered powers prepared her for confrontation with the entity responsible for her original trauma. In Russia, the escape plan reached its execution phase. None of these groups knew about the other's situations, yet they moved in synchronization toward the same end. The scattered investigations were about to converge into a unified battle, though the distances between them meant that communication and coordination would remain challenges throughout. The calm before the storm carried weight for all involved. Each person facing the coming crisis understood that survival was not guaranteed, that the forces arrayed against them exceeded anything previously encountered. The weapons they carried, both literal and metaphorical, seemed inadequate for the scope of the threat, yet they moved forward anyway, driven by love, loyalty, and the stubborn human refusal to accept defeat quietly. The scattered nature of their struggle would define its character, but not its outcome. That remained to be determined by events rapidly approaching their inevitable conclusion. The entity haunting Hawkins carried a name from a fantasy game, but his origins lay in tragedy, betrayal, and a twisted vision of order. His story began not in the Upside Down, but in a family home, where darkness took root long before dimensions collided. Understanding Vecna required understanding Henry Creel, and understanding Henry Creel meant confronting a past the town had tried to forget for nearly 3 decades. Nancy Wheeler, and Robin Buckley's investigation into Victor Creel had provided the first substantial lead. Their visit to Penhurst Asylum, achieved through elaborate deception involving fake identities and bribery, granted them access to a man the system had forgotten. Victor Creel, elderly and broken by decades of institutionalization, received few visitors. The two young women, presenting themselves as psychology students, found him eager to share the story he had been telling for years to audiences that refused to believe. The interview took place in a dim common area, Victor's restraints a constant reminder of how the institution viewed him. His account of March 25, 1959, had been documented in newspapers at the time, but those articles treated his testimony as the ravings of a murderer constructing an elaborate fantasy to avoid responsibility. Nancy and Robin, however, listened with the knowledge that impossible things were indeed possible. Victor described a week of escalating horror as his family experienced phenomena that defied explanation. The Creel family had moved into the house on Moorhead Street in early March 1959. Victor, a World War II veteran, had hoped the move would provide a fresh start for his troubled family. His wife Virginia suffered from what would now be recognized as severe mental illness, her condition creating tension throughout the household. Their daughter Alice, sensitive and artistic, withdrew into her own world. Their son Henry remained quiet, watchful, present but somehow absent. The house itself seemed to resist their presence from the beginning. Strange occurrences began immediately. Lights flickered without electrical cause. Animals on the property died mysteriously. Virginia's mental state deteriorated rapidly, her paranoid episodes increasing in frequency and intensity. Alice reported nightmares that left her screaming. Victor himself experienced visions of his time in the war, traumatic memories he thought he had successfully buried resurfacing with vivid clarity. Only Henry seemed unaffected, moving through the chaos with disturbing calm. The night of the massacre, as Victor recounted it, began with his family gathering for dinner. The lights failed completely, plunging the house into darkness. When Victor managed to light candles, he saw something moving in the shadows, something that should not have existed. His daughter Alice began screaming, her body lifting from her chair. The sounds of breaking bones filled the room as her limbs twisted. Her eyes, the last thing Victor saw before losing consciousness, had been destroyed from within. Victor woke to find his wife and daughter dead, their bodies broken in identical fashion. His son Henry lay in a coma, apparently untouched by whatever force had killed the others. Victor himself faced immediate arrest, the physical evidence and lack of any other explanation convincing authorities of his guilt. His insistence on a demon, on a supernatural force that had invaded his home, sealed his fate. The trial was brief, the verdict predetermined. Victor Creel was deemed criminally insane and committed to Penhurst, where he remained. Nancy and Robin, hearing this account, recognized elements that matched current events precisely. The broken bones, the destroyed eyes, the comatose survivor, all aligned with what had happened to Chrissy Cunningham and Fred Benson. The pattern suggested that whatever killed the Creel family had returned, or perhaps had never truly left. Victor's mention of his surviving son became the crucial detail. Henry Creel had disappeared from public records after recovering from his coma, his fate deliberately obscured. The investigation led the group to the house itself. The Creel house on Moorhead Street stood empty, avoided by the community through a combination of superstition and the very real sense that something about the structure was fundamentally wrong. No one had successfully lived there since 1959. Attempts to sell or renovate the property had failed repeatedly. The house waited, patient and malevolent, for those brave or foolish enough to enter. Max, Dustin, Steve, and Lucas approached the house as evening approached, aware that their investigation was drawing Vecna's attention, but believing that understanding the location might provide tactical advantage. The exterior appeared abandoned but structurally sound. Decades of neglect evident but not catastrophic. The door, surprisingly, opened easily when tested. The interior revealed a time capsule of 1950s suburban life. Furniture covered in dust, wallpaper peeling, but the layout intact. The search of the house proceeded cautiously. Each room offered glimpses into the Creel family's final days. Alice's artwork, disturbing even before her death, lined one bedroom's walls. Virginia's possessions suggested increasing paranoia and religious fervour. Victor's war memorabilia occupied the living room. The house itself seemed to watch their progress, the air heavy with something more than age and abandonment. The oppressive atmosphere increased as they climbed toward the attic. The attic space, accessed through a pull-down ladder, contained remnants of Henry's occupancy. This room, apparently the boys' sanctuary, held objects that suggested interests unusual for a child. Dead animals preserved in crude taxidermy, drawings of violence and suffering, a journal, its pages filled with observations about human behaviour, written with clinical detachment. The group's examination of these items was interrupted by a sound that froze them all, the chime of a grandfather clock. The clock standing in the corner of the attic should not have been functional. It appeared to be merely a prop, its mechanism long since ceased, yet it chimed, deep and resonant, marking time that had no relation to the hour. Max recognized it immediately from her visions. This clock, or its upside-down equivalent, appeared to every victim before their death. Its presence here, in the real world, suggested that the house existed in both dimensions simultaneously. The barrier between worlds had worn thin through decades of dark history. Understanding the curse's mechanism became essential to survival. The group's research, combining what they had witnessed, what Victor Creel had described, and what Max had experienced, revealed patterns that governed Vecna's attacks. The selection of victims followed specific criteria. Each person targeted carried significant psychological trauma, guilt, or grief that had not been properly processed. The curse exploited these emotional wounds, using them as entry points for invasion. The symptoms preceding death followed a predictable progression. Headaches began days before the attack, increasing in severity and frequency. Nosebleeds accompanied the headaches, the physical manifestation of psychic pressure. Nightmares disturbed sleep, each more vivid and disturbing than the last. Visions began appearing while awake, hallucinations that blurred the line between reality and memory. Finally came the trance state. The victim's consciousness pulled into Vecna's realm while their body remained vulnerable in the physical world. The deaths themselves required approximately 1 minute to complete. During that minute, the victim experienced their worst memories, forced to confront every moment of guilt, shame, and pain they carried. Vecna's voice accompanied these visions, speaking philosophies that justified his actions as liberation rather than murder. The psychological torture preceded the physical, the breaking of bones coming only after the breaking of spirit. The destruction of eyes, specifically, held symbolic weight. Vecna removed the victim's ability to see the world, a final assertion of his power over their perception and existence. The revelation that music could interrupt this process provided the group's only defensive tool. Max's survival of her first encounter, enabled by running up that hill, pulling her back from the edge of death, demonstrated that strong positive memories could counteract Vecna's psychological assault. The mechanism appeared to be neurological and emotional simultaneously. Music associated with happy memories activated different neural pathways, creating an anchor to life that Vecna's grip could not overcome. The effect was temporary, buying time rather than providing permanent protection, but time was enough. The 4 deaths Vecna required to open his gates followed a ritual logic that suggested the Upside Down operated on rules beyond human physics. Each death created a small tear in the barrier between dimensions, a wound in reality that radiated from the point of death back to a central location. 4 such tiers positioned correctly would converge on the house, where Vecna's physical body remained suspended. The pattern they would form, an X tearing through Hawkins, would widen sufficiently to allow the upside down to bleed through permanently. The timeline for subsequent attacks after a victim was cursed proved variable. Chrissy had died within days of showing symptoms. Fred similarly had little time between initial signs and death. Max, however, had been experiencing symptoms for longer, suggesting that Vecna's attention was divided or that he was waiting for optimal timing. The conclusion drawn was that Max would be targeted soon, possibly within hours or days. Her role as bait in the group's plan relied on this certainty. The true identity of their enemy emerged through the convergence of multiple sources of information. Nancy and Robin's research into Henry Creel's fate after 1959 led to sealed government files they accessed through determined investigation. Dr. Brenner's involvement with the boy became clear through these documents. Henry Creel, displaying extraordinary psychic abilities even in childhood, had attracted the attention of government scientists researching paranormal phenomena. Brenner, recognizing the boy's potential, had arranged for his placement in Hawkins National Laboratory. Henry became the first subject in what would become a long-running program. Designated as number 1, he predated 11 and all other numbered children by years. His abilities, fully manifested before arrival at the lab, exceeded anything later subjects would demonstrate. He could kill with thought, perceive minds, and manipulate matter at a molecular level. Brenner's attempts to study and control these abilities required the surgical implantation of a chip that suppressed Henry's powers while allowing limited access under controlled conditions. The years Henry spent as a lab prisoner, his powers restrained and his identity erased, created the resentment that would eventually explode into violence. Brenner treated him as an orderly, a janitor, an assistant who could observe newer subjects without them understanding they were being watched by a fellow victim. This role allowed Henry to study the children, particularly 11, whose potential he recognized immediately. His approach to her was patient, calculated, building trust over months before revealing his true intentions. The philosophy Henry developed during his imprisonment reflected a worldview formed in childhood and solidified through years of captivity. He believed that human civilization represented a corruption of natural order, that rules and social bonds created artificial constraints that weakened the species. His own family had demonstrated this corruption in his view. His mother's mental illness, his father's blindness to it, his sister's weakness, all exemplified how social structures damaged rather than protected. His solution was to free people from these constraints, through death if necessary. The events of September 8, 1979 represented Henry's attempt to implement this philosophy through direct action. Once 11 removed his suppressor chip, restoring his full powers, he began systematically executing everyone in the laboratory. The children he had observed and befriended died first, their deaths quick but absolute. The scientists and guards followed, their deaths slower and more theatrical. Brenner himself survived only by chance, hidden in a section Henry did not reach before 11's intervention. 11's battle with 1 transformed them both. She, accessing depths of power previously unexplored, cast him into another dimension. He, subjected to the trauma of interdimensional transit and the corrosive environment of the Upside Down, underwent transformation that erased his humanity. The dimension's properties, its decay and corruption, infected his body. Vines grew into his flesh, becoming part of him. His skin lost pigmentation, becoming pallid and scarred. His features distorted, human appearance giving way to something monstrous. The name Vecna, adopted from a Dungeons and Dragons character, suited his new form. The game's villain, a powerful lich who had achieved immortality through dark magic, provided parallel to his own situation. Trapped in a dimension of death, his body sustained through connection to the realm itself, he had become something between living and dead. His survival depended on the Upside Down, and the Upside Down's expansion into the human world became his obsession. The years spent in isolation, his injuries healing and his powers adapting to dimensional physics, allowed Vecna to plan methodically. He discovered or created the Mind Flayer, the vast consciousness that shared his goals. Whether he controlled the Mind Flayer or they existed in partnership remained unclear, but their alliance was certain. Every attack on Hawkins since 1983, every possession and invasion traced back to Vecna's desire for revenge against 11 and destruction of the world that had imprisoned him. The personal nature of his vendetta against 11 became clear through understanding their history. She had defeated him, something no one else had achieved. She had stripped away his powers and banished him to torment. His hatred for her, combined with recognition of her as his only real threat, meant that her current powerless state represented an opportunity he would not waste. The timing of his attacks, coming precisely when 11 had lost her abilities, was not coincidental but strategic. The relationship between Vecna and the broader Upside-Down ecosystem raised questions the group could not fully answer. The dimension had taken its form on November 6, 1983, when 11 first opened a gate, yet Vecna had been there since 1979, suggesting the dimension existed before that date, but in a different state. The frozen-in-time quality, with everything in the Upside Down reflecting Hawkins as it appeared in 1983, suggested that specific gate opening had imposed structure on previously chaotic space. The Mind Flayer's relationship to all of this remained the deepest mystery. Some theorized Vecna had created it from the dimension's raw material, shaping consciousness into a form that served his purposes. Others suggested the Mind Flayer had existed independently, with Vecna becoming its avatar or partner. The practical effect was the same. They worked in coordination, their goals aligned toward consumption and corruption of the human world. The revelation transformed the group's understanding of everything they had fought. This was not a series of separate incidents, but a continuous war stretching back years. Will's possession, Billy's transformation, the deaths of Bob Newby and Billy Hargrove, Hopper's apparent death, all connected to this single source. The enemy they had been fighting without seeing had been there since the beginning, patient and planning, while they responded to manifestations without understanding the cause. The implications for their current situation were profound. Defeating Vecna meant confronting the true source of all Upside-Down threats. However, Vecna's power, developed over years in a dimension where he held advantages, exceeded anything they had previously faced. His connection to the Mind Flayer meant that even if they succeeded against him physically, the broader consciousness might survive. The curse he had placed on Max represented just one weapon in an arsenal they had barely begun to comprehend. The personal connection between 11 and Vecna meant that her role in the coming battle was essential despite her physical distance from Hawkins. Only she had defeated him before. Only she possessed powers that matched his. Her recovery of those abilities through the Nina Project became more critical with this understanding. The scattered nature of the group, with their most powerful member hundreds of miles away, represented a tactical disadvantage Vecna had likely calculated into his plans. The clock in the Creel house attic chimed again as the group completed their investigation, a reminder that time was not their ally. Max's curse continued its progression, her death approaching with certainty unless they acted. The knowledge they had gained about Vecna's identity and methods provided strategic advantage, but knowledge alone could not stop what was coming. Action would be required, and soon. The scattered investigations were about to become a coordinated assault, though the coordination would prove challenging given the distances involved and the limited time remaining before Vecna claimed his fourth victim. The path forward required not convergence, but first a deeper separation. 3 missions unfolded simultaneously, each essential to the whole, yet proceeding with no knowledge of the other's progress. The fragmentation that had defined the group's current state would need to persist through one final phase before reunion could occur. Distance had weakened them, but paradoxically, only through maintaining that distance could the separate pieces necessary for victory fall into place. 11's journey to regain her powers took her to a facility in the Nevada desert, a location chosen for its remoteness and the difficulty any hostile force would face in approaching undetected. Dr. Sam Owens had arranged everything with the efficiency of someone accustomed to covert operations. The underground complex, accessed through a nondescript surface building, contained technology that blurred the line between science and something approaching magic. The Nina project represented years of research into memory, consciousness, and the relationship between psychological state and psychic ability. The revelation that Dr. Martin Brenner remained alive complicated 11's emotional response to the entire endeavour. Owens had kept this information from her until arrival, knowing she would have refused participation had she known earlier. Brenner's survival of the Demogorgon attack in 1983, his recovery in secret government medical facilities, and his continued research into psychic phenomena all became clear through conversations 11 could not avoid. The man who had raised her, abused her, and claimed to love her while treating her as an experiment stood before her, once again, offering to restore what she had lost. Brenner's approach to 11 combined the paternal warmth he had always employed with clinical detachment that revealed his true priorities. He spoke of her powers as though they were gifts he had given her, as though her abilities existed because of rather than despite his treatment. The manipulation was subtle, designed to make her feel gratitude for his continued presence and assistance. 11, older now and with years of life outside the laboratory, recognized the manipulation more clearly than she had as a child. Recognition did not make it less effective. The Nina project itself centered on a sensory deprivation tank, advanced beyond anything publicly available. The tank, filled with carefully calibrated salt water, allowed 11 to float in darkness and silence while technological systems interfaced with her brain patterns. The theory behind the process held that her powers had been suppressed through psychological trauma rather than physical damage. By allowing her to relive specific memories while in an altered state of consciousness, the barriers she had unconsciously created could be identified and dissolved. The first sessions achieved little beyond establishing baseline measurements and allowing 11 to acclimate to the technology. The water's temperature matched her body precisely, creating the sensation of floating in void. The darkness was absolute, no light. Penetrating the tank's sealed interior, sound ceased entirely, her own chattering heartbeat and breathing the only auditory input. In this state of sensory absence, memories became more vivid than external reality. The past could be experienced not as recollection, but as present moment. Brenner guided these sessions through a communication system that allowed his voice to reach 11 even in the tank's isolation. His questions directed her attention towards specific periods of her childhood, particularly the days and weeks preceding September 8, 1979. The memories she accessed initially were fragmentary and disconnected, snapshots of life in the laboratory that carried emotional weight but little narrative coherence. The children in their identical hospital gowns, the endless hallways, the testing rooms where they demonstrated their abilities under clinical observation. The memory of one emerged gradually across multiple sessions. The friendly orderly who had spoken kindly to her when others ignored her existence. Their conversations in quiet corners of the facility. His sharing of his own story as a victim of Brenner's manipulation. The trust she had developed, the belief that he understood her suffering because he shared it. This relationship, carefully reconstructed through the Nina sessions, revealed the depth of one's patience in his manipulation. He had spent months building her trust before making his request. The request itself, when the memory finally surfaced complete, carried weight 11 had not fully appreciated as a child. One had asked her to remove something from his neck, a device he claimed Brenner used to suppress his abilities. He presented it as liberation, as two prisoners freeing each other from their captor's control. 11, trusting him completely, by that point, had used her powers to extract the chip despite the pain it caused them both. The moment the chip came free, one's demeanor had changed instantly. The kindness evaporated, replaced by something cold and purposeful. The massacre that followed, relived through the Nina sessions with sensory completeness, traumatized 11 anew. She experienced again the sounds of screaming, the sight of bodies broken by invisible force, the smell of blood and fear permeating the facility. One moved through the corridors systematically, executing everyone he encountered. The children died in their rooms or the hallways where they had been playing. The scientists died in their laboratories, their research equipment destroyed along with them. The guards died attempting to stop something they could not touch or fight. 11's attempt to stop one, driven by horror at what she had enabled and desperate need to save anyone who remained alive, escalated into a psychic battle that pushed both of them beyond their previous limits. The fight was not physical in any conventional sense, though it left physical destruction in its wake. They threw each other through walls using pure force of will. They invaded each other's minds, seeking weakness or distraction that would provide advantage. The laboratory became a disaster zone, power fluctuating wildly, equipment exploding, the very structure of the building compromised. The decisive moment came when 11, accessing power she had not known she possessed, created an opening in space itself. The portal she generated did not lead to any location in the physical world, but to somewhere else entirely, a dimension of decay and shadow. She thrust one through this opening with every remaining bit of strength, her power depleting completely in the effort. The portal closed behind him, sealing him away from the world he had tried to reshape through murder. 11 collapsed, her memories of the event fragmenting immediately as her mind protected itself from the trauma. The understanding that she'd not caused the massacre, that the blood covering her, when Brenner found her, belonged to one's victims rather than her own, provided psychological relief even decades removed from the event. The guilt she had carried, the certainty that she was responsible for the deaths of children she had known, lifted as the true sequence of events became clear. This emotional unburdening, while valuable for its own sake, also removed one of the barriers preventing her powers from returning. The restoration of her abilities proceeded in stages across the Nina sessions. Initial signs were subtle, objects near the tank moving slightly when her emotions peaked during particularly intense memories. The telekinetic response strengthened with each session, her control returning as her confidence rebuilt. The progression was not linear, some days showing dramatic improvement, while others brought frustration and regression. However, the overall trajectory moved toward recovery. Brenner's presence throughout this process created constant tension. He treated each increment of returning power as validation of his methods, as proof that his approach to developing psychic ability had been correct all along. His claims that everything he had done, all the suffering he had caused, had been necessary for the greater good of preparing humanity for threats like the Upside Down, rang hollow to 11. She could see through his self-justification to the man who enjoyed control and feared irrelevance. The session's effectiveness, despite Brenner's involvement, could not be denied. By the second week, 11 could move objects intentionally while in the tank. By the third week, she could access her abilities even after emerging from the sessions, though the powers remained weaker than they had been at her peak. The gap between current capacity and former strength frustrated her, but progress continued steadily. The question became whether recovery would occur quickly enough to matter for the crisis developing in Hawkins. The assault on the Nevada facility came without warning. Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan, leading a military faction that viewed 11 as a threat requiring elimination rather than an asset requiring protection, had been tracking Owen's movements. His discovery of the Nina Project's location prompted immediate action. Sullivan's philosophy held that individuals with 11's capabilities represented unacceptable dangers to national security, that the risks they posed exceeded any potential benefits they might provide. His orders were clear: terminate the subject and destroy the research. The attack began with helicopter insertions around the facility's perimeter. Soldiers equipped for combat against both conventional and enhanced targets moved to breach the underground complex. Owens, alerted by security systems as the assault commenced, initiated emergency protocols. The facility lockdown bought time, but would not hold indefinitely against a determined military force. 11, pulled from a Nina session in progress, found herself vulnerable and disoriented as violence erupted around her. Brenner, in the chaos of evacuation, made choices that revealed his priorities. He delayed 11's escape, insisting on additional data downloads and equipment recovery. His years of research, the documentation of her power's restoration, held value to him that exceeded the immediate danger. 11, recognizing that he would sacrifice her safety for his work, made the decision to leave without him. Owen supported this choice, understanding that Brenner's obsession had always been with the power rather than the person. The escape from the facility took them through maintenance tunnels and emergency exits designed for exactly this contingency. Owens had planned for the possibility of hostile government action, his experience teaching him that different factions within the security apparatus often worked at cross purposes. The path led them to the surface miles from the main compound, where a vehicle waited with supplies and documentation. Brenner, wounded during the assault, followed despite not being part of Owen's priority evacuation list. The confrontation between 11 and Brenner occurred in the desert outside the facility, soldiers closing in, but minutes still remaining before capture. Brenner, dying from gunshot wounds sustained during escape, sought forgiveness or acknowledgement in his final moments. He spoke of love, of the sacrifices he had made, of the necessity of all he had done. 11, facing the man who had shaped her entire existence, recognized that he would die believing himself justified. She gave him neither forgiveness nor condemnation, simply the honest statement that he had been neither father nor friend, but captor. His death, when it came, ended a chapter of 11's life that had never properly closed. The complicated emotions his passing created would require processing later, when circumstances allowed for reflection. The immediate necessity was escape from Sullivan's forces, which continued their pursuit despite Brenner's death. Owens guided 11 to a Netkawahi nearby town where they took refuge in an abandoned pizza restaurant, Surfer Boy Pizza, waiting for extraction that Owens hoped he could arrange. Meanwhile, Mike Wheeler, Will Byers, Jonathan Byers, and their friend Argyle had been conducting their own investigation into 11's situation. Mike's desperation to help his girlfriend, combined with Will's sensing that something was wrong through his lingering connection to the Upside Down, drove them to track down information about her arrest and subsequent disappearance. The trail led them toward Nevada, though the specifics remained unclear until they managed to make contact with Owens through channels Mike had established during previous crises. The convergence of 11's group with Mike's group occurred at the Surfer Boy Pizza location, a reunion that provided both emotional relief and practical advantages. Mike and Will brought supplies, transportation via Argyle's distinctive pizza van, and additional support for whatever came next. Jonathan's presence reconnected Eleven to the family that had taken her in when she had nowhere else. The group, though still separated from those in Hawkins, at least had consolidated into a single unit capable of supporting each other. Eleven's powers, stressed by the attack and escape, required rest before reaching full effectiveness. The draining nature of what she had just survived, combined with the incomplete restoration process, left her capable, but not at the strength she would need for the confrontation she sensed approaching. The question became where to go and how to support their friends in Hawkins from a distance of hundreds of miles. The answer would require technology, coordination, and the peculiar properties of Eleven's abilities that allowed her to project consciousness across space. In Russia, Joyce Byers and Murray Bauman faced challenges of a different nature but equal urgency. Their capture and imprisonment in Kamchatka had placed them at the mercy of a system designed to break prisoners through labor, cold, and fear. The camp operated with brutal efficiency, its guards well practiced in extracting work from inmates, while providing minimum resources necessary for survival. Death was common enough to be unremarkable. Bodies disposed of without ceremony or documentation. Hopper's reunion with Joyce, occurring in the midst of this nightmare, brought emotions neither had time to properly process. Their separation for 6 months, during which Joyce believed him dead, created a gulf that would require conversation and time to cross. The immediate necessity of survival prevented those conversations, channeling their connection into practical cooperation rather than emotional resolution. The planning for escape consumed all available attention, leaving personal matters for a future that might not arrive. The prison's security relied on multiple layers of control. The physical barriers, chain-link fences topped with razor wire, and watchtowers manned by armed guards represented the most obvious but not most effective deterrent. The climate itself served as prison wall, the frozen Siberian landscape offering no shelter or sustenance for anyone attempting to flee on foot. Supply deliveries came by air or by transport vehicles designed for extreme conditions, neither accessible to prisoners. The systematic breaking of spirit through routine degradation kept most inmates from even considering escape. The Demogorgon, however, represented the most unique and terrifying aspect of Kamchatka's security apparatus. The creature, captured by Soviet forces during their Starcourt operation and transported to Russia at great expense, served multiple purposes. It provided entertainment for officers and guards through forced combat with prisoners. It discouraged escape attempts, as the creature's presence in the compound made any unsupervised movement potentially fatal. Most significantly, it demonstrated Soviet capabilities in controlling and weaponizing upside-down entities, a strategic advantage they believed justified the risks. Dmitri's plan for escape relied on corrupting the normal routines enough to create opportunity. His position as guard allowed him access to schedules, supply manifests, and communication systems. The arrival of Joyce and Murray, while initially complicating his scheme through Yuri's betrayal, actually provided additional resources and capabilities. Murray's combat training and intelligence background made him far more formidable than his disheveled appearance suggested. Joyce's determination and resourcefulness, demonstrated through multiple crises, added another dimension to the planning. The coordination of timing proved most challenging. The escape needed to occur when guard presence was minimized, but supply deliveries allowed for potential transportation. The Demogorgon's location and state needed to be accounted for, as encountering the creature during escape would prove fatal. Weather conditions needed to be survivable, though winter in Kamchatka meant survivable remained relative. The convergence of all these factors created narrow windows of opportunity that required precise timing. Yuri, the pilot whose betrayal had delivered Joyce and Murray to captivity, became an unlikely but necessary component of the revised escape plan. His plane, impounded at a nearby airfield, represented the only realistic means of covering the distance between the prison and any location offering safety. Convincing Yuri to assist rather than hinder required leveraging his self-interest, demonstrating that cooperation provided better outcomes than continued loyalty to those who had already paid him. Murray's particular skills in persuasion proved valuable in these negotiations. The practical preparations for escape occurred in stolen moments and hidden corners. Dmitri smuggled tools and supplies from guard facilities to prisoner areas. Hopper, using his knowledge of similar operations from his law enforcement background, identified weaknesses in the compound's security protocols. Joyce maintained maps and documentation smuggled piece by piece from administrative offices. Murray cultivated contacts among other prisoners who might be persuaded to create diversions at crucial moments. Each element had to be positioned without arousing suspicion. The Demogorgon's role in the escape became both obstacle and potential asset. The creature's presence in the compound required either avoiding its location entirely or confronting it directly. The former seemed impossible given the facility's layout. The latter appeared suicidal given the creature's demonstrated capability against trained soldiers. However, the discovery that the Demogorgons, and by extension all upside-down creatures, shared a hive mind connection to Vecna suggested a possibility. If Vecna were significantly injured or distracted, the creature's behavior might become erratic or weakened. This understanding created an unknown dependency in the escape plan. Events in Hawkins, completely beyond the Russia Group's knowledge or control, would determine whether the Demogorgon remained at full capacity or became vulnerable. The timing of the escape attempt relative to whatever confrontation was occurring in Indiana became critical, despite the impossibility of coordination. They would be operating on faith that others were fighting battles they could not see, trusting that the hive mind connection worked as theorized. In Hawkins itself, the preparation for final confrontation proceeded with grim determination. The plan that had emerged from collective discussion relied on Max serving as bait, her cursed status drawing Vecna's attention, while others attacked his physical form in the Upside Down. The risk to Max was extreme, her death not just possible, but likely. Her willingness to serve this role, driven by guilt over Billy, and sense that dying for purpose held more meaning than dying from depression, shaped the strategy's foundation. The entry point to the Upside Down required careful selection. Previous gates had been closed or were under government observation. The discovery of a natural gate at the bottom of Lover's Lake, formed through the multiple breaches and never properly sealed, provided access. The Watergate, as it came to be called, allowed passage between dimensions for those willing to dive to the lake's deepest point and swim through. The physical demands and risks of this entry method meant that only the most capable would attempt the crossing. Steve Harrington, Nancy Wheeler, and Robin Buckley volunteered for the assault team entering the Upside Down to attack Vecna's physical body. Steve's experience with the dimension and proven capability in crisis made him an obvious choice. Nancy's determination and shooting skills added lethal capacity the team needed. Robin's intelligence and problem-solving ability provided crucial support. Together, they would navigate the Upside Down version of Hawkins, locate the Creel house, and strike Vecna while he was vulnerable during his attack on Max. Eddie Munson and Dustin Henderson would provide distraction from the Upside Down side, drawing the bat creatures away from Creel house to prevent them from interfering with the assault team. This role, while not directly engaging Vecna, carried its own mortal dangers. The Demobats had killed before and would attack in swarms if given opportunity. The plan required Eddie and Dustin to make themselves targets, then survive long enough for the main assault to conclude. Eddie's willingness to participate, despite being hunted by the entire town for murders he did not commit, demonstrated courage that surprised even those who called him friend. Lucas Sinclair would remain with Max in the physical world, protecting her body while she served as bait. His role required watching someone he cared for suffer without ability to help, maintaining vigilance against threats like Jason Carver's vigilante group, while the actual battle occurred in a dimension he could not access. The assignment seemed less dangerous than the others, but carried psychological weight that matched or exceeded physical risk. Erica Sinclair, Lucas's younger sister, would provide technical support and communication, monitoring from a secure location while maintaining walkie-talkie contact. The weapons available for this confrontation included shotguns, Molotov cocktails, and improvised spears. The arsenal reflected their resources and understanding of what might be effective. Previous encounters had taught them that fire worked against upside-down creatures. The shotgun's stopping power could damage flesh, even flesh as corrupted as Vecna's. The spears provided reach and piercing capability. None of these weapons inspired confidence against an entity who could kill with thought, but they represented the tools available. The timing of the assault required coordination, despite limited communication capacity. Once Max entered her trance, serving as bait, the teams would have limited time before Vecna killed her. The entry through Watergate, the navigation to Creel House, and the actual attack needed to occur within that window. Any delay or complication could result in Max's death before the assault succeeded. The margin for error was non-existent. The plan's success dependent on precise execution under extreme pressure. The emotional weight of these preparations affected each person differently. Steve, having developed a protective relationship with the younger group members, carried responsibility for keeping them alive when everything in his experience suggested some would not survive. Nancy, torn between her role here and her distant relationship with Jonathan, focused on the immediate tactical requirements to avoid thinking about broader implications. Robin, terrified but determined not to show fear, maintained her characteristic verbal processing of anxiety. Dustin, having already lost Bob Newby to the Upside Down, faced the possibility of losing Eddie while feeling responsible for bringing him into danger. Lucas wrestled with guilt over his divided loyalties and fear for Max's survival. Eddie, still processing being accused of satanic murders while actually preparing to fight interdimensional monsters, found dark humor in the absurdity, even as terror threatened to overwhelm him. Max's emotional state was perhaps most complex. Her willingness to die was not suicidal ideation in the conventional sense, but a calculated decision that her death in service of others held more value than her continued survival in depression. She had written letters to everyone who mattered, final words in case she did not return. The act of writing these letters forced her to articulate feelings she'd been suppressing, to acknowledge love and connection she had been denying. The catharsis this provided, combined with the sense of purpose the plan gave her, actually improved her mental state even as she prepared to face death. The three separate missions, Eleven's recovery in Nevada, the escape from Kamchatka, and the preparation in Hawkins, would need to converge temporally, even though the participants had no means of coordination. The battles about to begin would be won or lost based on timing that was as much fortune as planning. The distances that had weakened the group throughout this crisis would persist through the climax, each location fighting its own engagement, while trusting that others were doing the same. The path forward demanded faith in unseen allies and belief that individual courage could somehow combine across impossible separations into unified victory. The hours before battle carried a strange quality, suspended between normal life and approaching chaos. Hawkins continued its rhythms, while those who knew the truth made final preparations, said possible goodbyes, and confronted fears they had carried since childhood. Friday, March 27th, 1986, dawned clear and mild, spring asserting itself against winter's retreat. Students attended classes, workers punched time clocks, and the routines of small-town life proceeded without knowledge that the evening might bring either salvation or destruction. Max Mayfield spent the morning writing letters she hoped would never be read. The activity had begun days earlier, when the certainty of her role as bait had become clear. Each letter required thought about what final words should convey, how to summarize relationships that defied easy expression. She wrote to her mother, attempting to explain why she had been so distant while expressing love that grief had not erased. She wrote to Lucas, acknowledging feelings she had been unwilling to voice while alive. She wrote to 11, thanking the friend who had accepted her without judgment. She wrote to Dustin, Mike, Will, Steve, and others whose presence had made life bearable, even when she wanted it to end. The physical act of writing these letters provided unexpected catharsis. Articulating what each person meant forced Max to acknowledge connections she had been denying. The isolation she had chosen as protection against further loss revealed itself as another form of suffering, one she had imposed on herself and those who cared about her. The understanding came too late to change her choices over the past 6 months, but awareness provided comfort. She had been loved despite her withdrawal, supported despite her rejection of that support. The letters represented both goodbye and apology, final words and belated gratitude. Her letter to Billy proved most difficult to complete. The complicated tangle of emotions his death had created, relief and grief existing simultaneously, guilt over feeling relieved that he was gone, mixed with genuine mourning for the person he might have become, defied clear expression. She wrote multiple drafts, each attempting different approaches. The final version acknowledged the complexity without trying to resolve it, accepting that some relationships remained messy even in retrospect. She forgave him for his cruelty, while forgiving herself for her ambivalence about his sacrifice. The visit to Billy's grave that morning carried different weight than previous visits. Max had come here repeatedly over 6 months, each time drowning in guilt and grief without resolution. This visit, knowing it might be her last, allowed for a different kind of conversation with the dead. She spoke aloud, telling Billy about the plan, about her choice to face death, rather than wait for it to claim her passively. She acknowledged that his sacrifice had given her 6 additional months of life, months she had largely wasted in depression, but which had value nonetheless. The conversation provided closure she had not expected to find. The Walkman clipped to her belt, loaded with her carefully curated tape, featuring Kate Bush's "Running Up That Hill," cue to start, represented both protection and symbol. The song had saved her once already, its association with memories of happier times providing anchor when Vecna's curse tried to pull her into death. The relationship between music and memory, the way certain songs could transport consciousness across time to moments of joy or connection, had become her lifeline. She had listened to the tape obsessively, reinforcing the neural pathways that associated these sounds with life rather than death. Steve Harrington's role in the final preparations combined practical leadership with emotional support that reflected his growth over the past few years. The teenage boy who had cared primarily about popularity and appearance had transformed into someone who prioritized others' well-being above his own comfort or safety. His protective instincts toward the younger group members, particularly Dustin and Max, drove many of his decisions. The responsibility he felt for keeping them alive weighed heavily, his experience having taught him that good intentions did not guarantee good outcomes. His relationship with Robin Buckley provided stability during the preparation period. Their friendship, forged through shared trauma and sustained through genuine affection, allowed them to be completely honest with each other about fear and doubt. Robin's tendency to process anxiety through rapid-fire verbal expression met Steve's preference for quieter support, creating a dynamic that worked despite their different approaches. They spent the afternoon before the assault inventorying weapons and supplies, while discussing everything except the actual danger they would face. The weapons themselves, laid out in Steve's bedroom, where they had been gathering equipment, represented humanity's limited options when facing supernatural threats. The shotgun Nancy would carry had been procured through family connections, its presence technically illegal, but practically necessary. The Molotov cocktails, bottles filled with gasoline and stuffed with cloth wicks, relied on fire's effectiveness against upside-down creatures demonstrated in previous encounters. The spears improvised from sharpened metal rods and wooden handles provided reach when getting close. To threats meant death. Each item had been tested and prepared with care that reflected understanding of what failure would cost. Eddie Munson's journey, from fleeing to choosing to fight, represented transformation that surprised even those who knew him well. His self-perception as coward, someone who ran when confronted with danger, had been central to his identity since childhood. His father's criminal activities and subsequent imprisonment had taught Eddie that self-preservation outweighed loyalty or principle. The decision to flee his trailer after Chrissy's death had felt automatic, the only logical response to being blamed for murder he did not commit. His time in hiding, however, had forced confrontation with whether he wanted to remain the person who ran. Dustin Henderson's friendship provided the catalyst for Eddie's change. Dustin, who had believed Eddie's innocence without hesitation, who had risked his own safety to help Eddie hide and eventually clear his name, demonstrated a loyalty Eddie had rarely experienced. The younger boy's confidence in him, treating him as hero rather than coward, created cognitive dissonance that required resolution. Eddie could continue being the person he believed himself to be, or he could become the person Dustin already saw. The choice seemed obvious when framed that way. The plan for Eddie and Dustin's role in the assault, providing distraction in the Upside Down by drawing the Dima Bats swarm away from Creel House, appealed to Eddie's developing sense of purpose while terrifying him completely. The Bats had nearly killed Steve in a previous encounter, their numbers and viciousness overwhelming even with multiple defenders. Drawing their attention deliberately, making himself and Dustin targets, violated every survival instinct Eddie possessed. Yet the role was necessary. The assault team could not fight both Vecna and his guardians simultaneously. Someone had to provide distraction, and Eddie's guitar skills offered a method of attraction that suited his capabilities. The choice of Metallica's Master of Puppets for the Distraction concert reflected both practical considerations and personal meaning. The song, released earlier that March, represented the cutting edge of metal music. Its aggressive sound and complex structure would carry through the Upside Down's atmosphere, attracting attention across distance. For Eddie personally, the song embodied everything he loved about music: its power to transform reality through pure sound. The irony of using music about manipulation and control to fight an entity that specialized in exactly that was not lost on him. His relationship with his uncle Wayne provided the deepest source of Eddie's conflicted emotions about the coming battle. Wayne had raised Eddie after his father's imprisonment, providing stability and unconditional acceptance despite limited resources. Their trailer park home, small and shabby by most standards, represented safety and family to Eddie. Wayne's refusal to believe the town's accusations against Eddie, his continued defense of his nephew, despite the evidence and community pressure, exemplified loyalty Eddie desperately wanted to deserve. The possibility of dying while Wayne still believed him a murderer created pain that exceeded fear of death itself. Eddie's humor, deployed constantly during the preparation period, served as defense mechanism against emotional overwhelm. His jokes about the absurdity of their situation, fighting interdimensional monsters while being hunted as a satanic cult leader, provided release valve for tension that might otherwise paralyze. The laughter he generated, even nervous laughter, created moments of normalcy that allowed the group to function. His self-deprecating comments about cowardice and his mockery of the town's satanic panic both distanced him from the terror and acknowledged it simultaneously. The town's descent into panic and violence created a dangerous backdrop to the supernatural threat. Jason Carver's crusade against Hellfire Club had escalated from accusations to active hunting. The basketball team, united in their grief over Chrissy's death and their loyalty to Jason, had become a vigilante force. Their certainty about Eddie's guilt, combined with the town's existing prejudices against metalheads and Dungeons and Dragons players, created an environment where violence seemed justified. Several suspected Hellfire members had been harassed or attacked, the distinction between suspicion and guilt erased in the emotional atmosphere. The town meeting held on Thursday evening, the day before the planned assault, revealed the depth of community division. Parents packed the high school gymnasium, demanding answers about the murders and actions against the perceived satanic threats. The satanic panic, a cultural phenomenon affecting communities across America in the mid-1980s, had found fertile ground in Hawkins. The combination of actual murders with existing fears about role-playing games and heavy metal music created a moral panic that rationality could not penetrate. Calls for banning Dungeons and Dragons, for investigating anyone associated with alternative culture, for vigilante justice against suspects, all received enthusiastic support from significant portions of the audience. Wayne Munson's presence at that meeting, standing to defend his nephew despite the hostile crowd, demonstrated courage that matched any planned for the supernatural battle. His simple statement that Eddie was innocent, that he knew his nephew, and the accusations were lies, met with jeers and threats. His refusal to sit down or recant, maintaining his defense even when it seemed the crowd might turn violent, showed a loyalty that Eddie would never know about, but which defined the man who raised him. Wayne left that meeting more isolated than ever, but with his integrity intact. Lucas Sinclair found himself caught between worlds in ways that created unique anguish. His position on the basketball team, achieved through genuine athletic skill, and his desire for social acceptance, placed him within Jason's inner circle. His true loyalties to his friends and to the truth about what was really happening in Hawkins required him to deceive his teammates, while preparing to betray their trust completely. The championship game scheduled for Friday evening, which would occur during the planned assault, represented the culmination of the basketball team's season. Lucas's absence would be noted and questioned, potentially compromising the mission while certainly ending his basketball career. His relationship with Max added another layer of complexity to his situation. Their romantic connection, which had been on and off throughout the school year as Max withdrew into grief, had recently stabilized into something more mature than their middle school romance. Lucas's persistence in supporting Max despite her rejection of that support had slowly broken through her isolation. His willingness to stay with her during the assault, protecting her physical body while she served as bait, meant accepting that he might watch her die without being able to help. The possibility created fear that exceeded any he had felt during previous encounters with the Upside Down. Erica Sinclair's role in the operation, despite her youth, reflected capabilities that had been demonstrated in previous crises. Her intelligence, particularly regarding technology and systems, made her valuable for the technical support aspects of the plan. Her willingness to participate, knowing the dangers involved, showed courage inherited from or shared with her brother. The coordination required between different team locations, maintaining communication through walkie-talkies while monitoring multiple situations, needed someone detail-oriented and unflappable. Erica's personality, simultaneously irritating and impressive, suited these requirements perfectly. The final preparations across different locations created a sense of inevitability that affected everyone involved. In the upside-down approach, Steve, Nancy, and Robin gathered their weapons at Steve's house, each checking and rechecking equipment while avoiding discussion of what failure would mean. At the trailer park, Eddie and Dustin prepared the guitar and amplifier that would serve as their distraction tool, the equipment requiring modification to function in the upside-down's environment. At the Creel house in the real world, Max reviewed her Walkman, ensuring the tape was positioned correctly and batteries were fresh. Lucas and Erica confirmed their positioning and communication protocols. The emotional weight of potential final goodbyes pressed on relationships already strained by years of crisis. Steve and Robin's friendship, defined by complete honesty and acceptance, required no dramatic farewell. They understood what they meant to each other without needing to articulate it. Nancy and Steve's complicated history, their past romance and current friendship, existing in uncomfortable proximity, created unspoken tension that neither addressed. Robin's awareness of both their feelings and her own outsider status made her simultaneously sympathetic and annoyed. Dustin and Eddie's bond, formed rapidly under extraordinary circumstances, had deepened into genuine affection that transcended their age difference and different social positions. Dustin's hero worship of Eddie had transformed into friendship between equals, with Eddie recognizing that Dustin's intelligence and courage exceeded his own in many ways. Their mutual decision to face the Daemabats together, each protecting the other, reflected a trust that neither had extended to many people. The unspoken acknowledgement that one or both might not survive created a bittersweet quality to their final hours together. Max and Lucas's relationship, tested by her grief and his patience, had evolved into something more resilient than their middle school romance. Lucas's presence during the assault, his choice to stay with her rather than pursue his basketball championship, communicated commitment that words could not match. Max's acceptance of his support, her allowing him to be present for her potential death, showed trust she'd been unable to give for months. Their last conversation before the assault began avoided sentimentality, focusing instead on practical matters and shared determination to see the plan through. The convergence of afternoon into evening brought the point of no return. The decision to proceed with the assault could no longer be postponed or revised. Each person involved made final checks of equipment and position. Steve, Nancy and Robin prepared to dive into Lover's Lake, their waterproof bags containing weapons and supplies sealed carefully. Eddie and Dustin loaded equipment into Eddie's van for transport to his trailer, where the gate in his ceiling would provide their entry to the Upside Down. Max positioned herself in the Creel house living room, Lucas beside her, both of them aware that the next hour would determine not just their own fates, but potentially the fate of everyone in Hawkins. In Nevada, Eleven prepared for her own role in the battle through methods the Hawkins group could not replicate. Her recovered powers, while not at full strength, allowed for projection of consciousness across vast distances. The pizza freezer where she and Owens had taken refuge provided the isolation necessary for this attempt. Mike, Will, Jonathan, and Argyle prepared the makeshift sensory deprivation environment, using materials at hand to create conditions that would allow Eleven to enter the necessary meditative state. The salt bath that Nina had provided was unavailable, but calm water and darkness could achieve similar effects. Eleven's understanding of what she needed to do remained incomplete. The connection between Vecna's attack on Max and the broader battle in Hawkins meant that intervening at the right moment could tip the balance. However, the timing had to be precise. Entering Max's consciousness too early would alert Vecna to interference before the physical assault began. Entering too late would result in Max's death before help could arrive. The coordination required seemed impossible given the lack of communication between Nevada and Indiana. Eleven would need to sense the right moment through her connection to Max and to the Upside Down itself. Mike's presence provided emotional anchor for Eleven's preparation. His encouragement, his absolute belief in her capability, gave her confidence that complemented her own determination. Will's understanding of the Upside Down, through his possession years earlier, provided insights that helped Eleven comprehend what she would face in Vecna's mindscape. Jonathan's quiet support and Argyle's surprisingly perceptive observations about consciousness and connection added layers of assistance that came from unexpected sources. The group in Nevada, like their counterparts in Hawkins, prepared to do their part in a battle none of them fully understood. In Russia, the final elements of the escape plan fell into place with timing that seemed almost miraculous. Dimitri's coordination of guard schedules and supply deliveries, Joyce's acquisition of necessary tools and provisions, Murray's cultivation of prisoner support, and Hopper's physical preparation for the violence that would certainly be required, all converged toward the same evening. The fact that their escape attempt would occur simultaneously with the Hawkins assault was coincidental, yet the hive mind connection between upside-down creatures meant that timing might prove advantageous in ways they could not anticipate. Hopper's preparation included confronting the possibility that he might not survive to see Joyce or his adopted daughter, Eleven, again. The months in Kamchatka had stripped away any illusions about mortality or guaranteed outcomes. His decision to risk everything on an escape attempt with low probability of success reflected his character, preference for action over passive acceptance of fate. The understanding that others depended on his survival, that Joyce had come to Russia specifically to rescue him, provided motivation beyond simple self-preservation. He would escape or die trying, but he would not remain captive. Joyce's emotional state combined determination with fear she could barely control. Her journey to Russia, based on fragile evidence that Hopper might be alive, had been driven by hope that reason suggested was foolish, the confirmation that he did indeed survive, that her instincts had been correct, vindicated her decision while raising the stakes impossibly higher. Having found him, the possibility of losing him during escape created terror that threatened to paralyze. She channeled that terror into focus on practical tasks, allowing action to substitute for emotional processing she could not afford during crisis. Murray's role in the escape, while crucial, also carried a quality of absurd adventure that matched his personality. His life had been defined by conspiracy theories, covert operations, and situations that sounded ridiculous when described but proved deadly serious in execution. Escaping a Soviet prison camp with a former police chief and a small-town mother, while dodging a Demogorgon fit perfectly into the pattern of his existence. His combination of genuine capability and complete ridiculousness in effect made him simultaneously reliable and irritating to those working with him. The preparations complete, the separate groups in their separate locations waited for darkness and the moment when action would replace planning. In Hawkins, the sun set over a town unaware that its continued existence balanced on the courage of teenagers. In Nevada, artificial lights replaced natural ones as Eleven entered the meditative state necessary for her intervention. In Russia, the cold darkness of Siberian night brought both cover and danger for those about to attempt the impossible. The scattered nature of the resistance, split across thousands of miles and multiple time zones, created vulnerabilities, but also meant that failure in one location did not guarantee failure everywhere. The emotional texture of these final hours before battle varied by individual, but shared common threads of fear, determination, and love for those who would be risked. No one involved believed victory was certain or even likely. Each understood that death was probable for at least some of them. Yet they moved forward anyway, driven by the human capacity to hope, even when hope seemed irrational, to fight even when defeat seemed assured, to love even when loss seemed inevitable. As night settled over Hawkins on that late March evening, 3 simultaneous battles prepared to begin, each connected through the hive mind of the Upside Down, each essential to the other's success. The time for preparation had passed. Now came the moment when courage would be tested against darkness, when the bonds formed through shared struggle would either prove sufficient or fail completely, when the question of whether ordinary people could defeat extraordinary evil would finally receive its answer. The final confrontation unfolded not in a single location, but across multiple planes of existence. In Hawkins, in Nevada, in Mines and in Matter, the battle for humanity's future played out through the courage of teenagers who had already given so much. The evening of March 27, 1986 would be remembered by those who survived it as the night when distance collapsed into connection, when separate struggles merged into unified purpose despite the miles and dimensions between them. Max Mayfield sat in the abandoned Creel House living room, her Walkman resting beside her on the dusty floorboards. Lucas Sinclair occupied a chair nearby, his position chosen to allow him to watch both Max and the doors through which threats might enter. Erica, stationed in the basement with walkie-talkie and flashlight, monitored for any signs of Jason Carver's group approaching. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, decades of dark history creating an atmosphere that pressed against the living who dared intrude. The plan required Max to remove her headphones deliberately, to allow Vecna's curse to pull her into the trance state that preceded death. This voluntary surrender to something that had nearly killed her before demanded courage that exceeded anything previously asked of her. The Walkman, loaded with "Running Up That Hill" cued and ready, represented her only lifeline back to consciousness. Lucas would watch for signs that she needed rescue, playing the song when her life appeared most threatened. The timing would be crucial. Too early meant alerting Vecna to interference before the assault team reached him. Too late meant Max's death before music could save her. Max looked at Lucas, meeting his eyes with an expression that communicated everything words could not. Her hand reached for the headphones, pausing for a moment as she took a final breath of the real world's air. Then she removed them completely, placing them beside the Walkman with deliberate care. Her eyes remained open initially, still seeing the decrepit living room and Lucas's worried face. Then the trance took her, her gaze becoming distant and fixed. Her body, rigid as consciousness, departed for Vecna's realm. Lucas watched the transformation with horror he tried to suppress. Max's catatonic state, so similar to what he'd heard described from Chrissy and Fred's deaths, made real the danger they had been discussing theoretically. His hand moved to the Walkman, ready to play her song at the first sign of physical distress. The wait began, each second stretching as he monitored her frozen form for changes that would indicate the curse progressing toward its fatal conclusion. Max's consciousness arrived in a place that was and was not Hawkins. The landscape carried the town's geography, but existed in a state of decay that marked it clearly as the Upside Down's reflection. The sky roiled with red clouds, lightning that cast no real illumination flickering constantly. The air tasted of rotten copper. The buildings around her stood as empty shells, their windows dark and their structures compromised by vines that grew through every surface. She walked forward, not by choice but by compulsion, drawn toward a destination she could sense but not yet see. The visions began as promised. Billy appeared first, not as he had been in life, but as he existed in her memory and guilt. His face held the expression from his final moments, pain and acceptance mixed with something that might have been love, or might have been her projection of what she wished he had felt. He spoke words designed to wound, accusations that articulated her deepest fears about her relief at his death. The psychological assault cut deeper than physical torture could have, each word striking at vulnerabilities only she could know. Her mother manifested next, drunk and angry, listing every disappointment Max had created, every way she had failed to be the daughter who could have prevented their family's disintegration. The words mixed truth with distortion, taking real criticisms and amplifying them into absolute condemnation. Max understood intellectually that these were not really Billy or her mother, that Vecna was simply using her memories against her. Understanding did not blunt the emotional impact. The guilt she carried provided all the material Vecna needed to construct torments perfectly calibrated to her psychological wounds. The landscape shifted as she walked, the town giving way to the Creel house in its upside-down configuration. The structure loomed before her, more prison than building, its windows like eyes watching her approach. She entered through the front door, compelled forward by force beyond her control. The interior matched the real Creel house, but transformed by decay and malevolence. The stairs led upward toward the attic, where she knew Vecna waited. Each step required effort, as though the house itself resisted her presence, while simultaneously drawing her deeper. The attic space, when she finally reached it, contained the entity she had encountered before. Vecna emerged from shadow, his form a nightmare fusion of human origin and dimensional corruption. The vines that had grown into and through him moved as extensions of his body, tentacles and supports that blurred the line between creature and environment. His face, still bearing traces of Henry Creel beneath the monstrous transformation, watched her with intelligence that made his appearance more terrifying rather than less. His voice, when he spoke, carried multiple tones simultaneously. Henry Creel's educated accent layered over something ancient and inhuman, the words resonating in ways that bypassed ears to impact consciousness directly. He told her things about herself, observations that demonstrated his time inside her mind had taught him everything about her fears and failures. He explained, with the certainty of someone sharing established truth rather than opinion, why her death served necessary purposes. The world required cleansing. Human bonds represented weakness that prevented evolution. Her suffering would end while enabling others to achieve liberation through his expanding realm. Max listened to his philosophy, to his justifications for murder framed as mercy, and invasion framed as liberation. She recognized the seductive quality of his arguments, how they offered meaning to suffering and purpose to pain. The temptation to accept, to stop fighting, and allow death to bring the peace she had been seeking through isolation, created a moment of genuine uncertainty. Then she thought of Lucas waiting in the real world, of her friends risking everything to save her, of the letters she had written, expressing love she had been too afraid to speak. The choice crystallized into clarity. She rejected Vecna's offer, refused his philosophy, and prepared to fight for a world whose flaws did not justify its destruction. In Nevada, 11 submerged into the makeshift sensory deprivation environment her friends had created, the bathtub filled with cool water, the lights extinguished completely, the silence broken only by her own breathing. Mike, Will, Jonathan, and Argyle maintained vigil outside the bathroom, ready to assist if needed, but unable to help with the battle she would fight in consciousness alone. 11's awareness expanded outward, seeking Max across the impossible distance between Nevada and Indiana. The connection, when it formed, pulled 11 into Max's mindscape with disorienting force. She perceived Vecna's presence immediately, his psychic signature, unmistakable, even at remove. The mental battlefield took shape around her, the upside-down's version of Hawkins manifesting as shared hallucination between predator and prey. 11's intrusion created ripples in the constructed reality, alerting Vecna to interference he had not anticipated. His attention shifted partially from Max to this new threat, buying seconds that translated to salvation. The confrontation between 11 and Vecna replayed their 1979 battle in new context. Both had changed since that day. 11 no longer the frightened child, and Vecna no longer freshly powerful, but transformed by years in dimensional exile. They recognized each other immediately, their connection deeper than simple history. He had been her first real enemy. She had been his defeater and the instrument of his banishment. The personal nature of their conflict intensified the psychic combat that erupted. Vecna's assault came first. his greater experience in this form of battle providing initial advantage. He struck at her identity, at the guilt she carried over the lab massacre she had believed herself responsible for. He showed her visions of the children dying, reminded her that removing his chip had enabled the deaths, even if she had not directly caused them. The psychological attack sought to paralyze her through self-doubt and remorse. 11, however, had processed these memories through the Nina project, had accepted her role without being destroyed by it. His weapons had been blunted by the very process meant to restore her powers. Her counterattack focused on his humanity, on the Henry Creel who had existed before corruption transformed him. She perceived the child who had been different, who had frightened his own family through powers he did not understand or control. She saw the pain of isolation, of being feared by those who should have loved him. The empathy she felt for that child did not excuse the monster he had become, but it provided insight into vulnerabilities he had thought buried beneath years of self-justification. Her assault reminded him of what he had been before choosing to become what he was. The battle escalated beyond psychology into pure force of will. They threw power against power, consciousness against consciousness, each seeking to overwhelm the other through mental strength that translated into physical reality within the mindscape. The upside-down environment around them fractured and reformed constantly, architecture bending to reflect their conflict. Max, caught between them, found herself protected by 11's presence, even as she remained Vecna's nominal target. The reprieve allowed her to gather herself, to resist the pull toward death that had been overwhelming her before intervention arrived. Mike's voice, reaching 11 through the distance that separated Nevada from her consciousness's current location, provided anchor that strengthened her efforts. His encouragement, his absolute belief in her capability, gave her reserves she had not known remained. Will's understanding of the upside down, his residual connection to the dimension through his possession years earlier, allowed him to sense when 11 needed support, and to communicate that need to Mike. The connection between all of them, forged through years of shared crisis, manifested as tangible force in the battle being fought. Vecna's confidence, initially absolute, began developing cracks as 11's resistance continued. He had planned this assault based on her powerless state, had chosen his timing specifically to exploit her vulnerability. Her recovery through the Nina project, her intervention, despite the distance, represented variables he had not accounted for. The realization that his advantage was not as complete as assumed created the first hints of concern beneath his arrogant certainty. In the Upside Down's physical realm, Eddie Munson stood on the roof of his trailer with an electric guitar in his hands and determination warring with terror in his mind. Dustin Henderson crouched beside him, surrounded by amplifiers and equipment they had hauled through dimensions. The upside-down version of Eddie's trailer park stretched around them, familiar geography rendered alien through decay and darkness. The sky roiled overhead, the perpetual storm that defined this realm's atmosphere, creating backdrop for the concert they were about to perform. The plan required drawing the Demobat swarm away from Creel House, preventing the creatures from interfering with Steve, Nancy, and Robin's assault on Vecna's physical body. Music would serve as lure, the sound carrying through the dimensions strange acoustics to attract attention from miles away. Eddie had chosen Metallica's Master of Puppets for its aggressive sound and personal significance. The song, released less than a month earlier, represented everything he loved about metal music. Its complexity, its power, its refusal to compromise for commercial appeal all resonated with his own approach to art and life. He began playing, fingers moving across the fretboard with confidence built through years of practice. The opening notes cut through the Upside Down's ambient noise, clean and defiant. The amplifiers, powered by generators they had scavenged and modified, projected the sound across impossible distances. Dustin, watching Eddie perform, with expression, combining pride and fear, prepared himself for what would come next. They had perhaps minutes before the swarm arrived, minutes to feel briefly like rock stars before becoming bait for monsters. The solo, when Eddie reached it, became more than musical performance. It became statement of defiance against everything the Upside Down represented. This realm of decay and corruption, of darkness and predetermined death, could not prevent beauty from existing. The music proved that creation was possible, even in environments designed to destroy. Eddie poured everything into his playing, knowing this might be his final performance, wanting it to be worthy of remembrance if anyone survived to remember. The Demobats appeared as a cloud on the horizon, hundreds or thousands of creatures responding to the sound. Their screeching added discordant counterpoint to the music, anticipation of violence mixing with the melody's aggressive rhythm. They came fast, far faster than Eddie and Dustin had hoped, the distance collapsing as they flew with unified purpose. Eddie finished the song's final notes as the swarm descended, then ran with Dustin for the trailer below, the plan requiring they reach shelter before the bats reached them. The trailer's interior provided temporary protection, the doors and windows offering barriers the bats would need time to breach. Eddie and Dustin barricaded entry points using furniture and desperation to reinforce walls that had never been designed to resist assault. The creatures struck the exterior with force that shook the structure, their teeth and claws tearing at metal and wood. The sound of their attack, hundreds of impacts occurring simultaneously, created cacophony that made communication difficult and thought nearly impossible. The gate in Eddie's ceiling, the portal through which they had entered from the real world, remained open as their planned escape route. The plan required them to hold the trailer until the assault team completed their mission, then flee back to Hawkins before the bats breached defences. The timing was theoretical, based on estimates of how long the assault would require. Reality, as usual, refused to cooperate with planning. The bats broke through faster than anticipated, finding weaknesses in the barricades and exploiting them with intelligence that suggested coordination beyond animal instinct. Dustin made it to the rope, hanging from the ceiling gate, beginning his climb towards safety. Eddie followed, his hands grasping the rope as bats poured through the breached window. Then he stopped. The decision formed in a moment, instinct and character, combining into choice that defied self-preservation. If he climbed through now, the bats would follow into the real world. The gate would bring them into Hawkins, where they could kill people who had no defences against supernatural threats. His entire life had been defined by running from danger, by choosing survival over heroism. This time, for once, he chose differently. Eddie cut the rope. Dustin, already through the gate and safe in the real world, screamed for Eddie to climb, not understanding what his friend had done. Eddie looked up at him, their eyes meeting across the dimensional barrier, and smiled. His words, barely audible over the bats shrieking, carried acceptance and peace. He told Dustin he did not run this time. Then he turned to face the swarm alone, armed with a spear and shield improvised from trash can lid, determined to buy every additional second he could for the assault team to complete their mission. The fight that followed was brief and brutal. Eddie fought with courage that surprised even himself, the spear finding targets, the shield deflecting attacks that would have been immediately fatal. He killed several of the creatures before their numbers overwhelmed him. They dragged him down, teeth finding flesh, his blood mixing with the Upside Down's perpetual decay. The pain exceeded anything he had imagined, but beneath it ran satisfaction that he had finally been the person Dustin believed him to be, that his last act would be heroism rather than cowardice. Dustin, trapped on the wrong side of the cut rope, could only watch as Eddie died. His screams attracted no help, changed nothing, served only to let Eddie know he was not dying alone. When the bats finally released Eddie's body, having drained what they needed, Dustin found a way back through the gate. He crawled to Eddie's side, cradling his friend's broken form, whispering apologies and gratitude that Eddie could no longer hear. The sacrifice had bought the time needed, had proven the courage that Eddie had never believed he possessed, had been everything a hero's death was supposed to be, except in one crucial respect. No one outside this small group would ever know, would ever credit Eddie Munson with anything beyond the murders he had been falsely accused of committing. Steve Harrington, Nancy Wheeler, and Robin Buckley reached the Creel house in the Upside Down after navigating streets they knew by heart, but which existed here in corrupted form. The journey from the Watergate at Lover's Lake through the decayed town had proceeded faster than anticipated, their familiarity with Hawkins' geography allowing efficient navigation even in darkness. They carried weapons that seemed inadequate against what they would face, but weapons were all they had. The shotgun Nancy gripped had been checked and rechecked, its shells specialized for maximum stopping power. The Molotov cocktails Steve carried, glass bottles filled with gasoline, represented fire's proven effectiveness against upside-down entities. Robin's spear, more primitive, but no less necessary, provided reach when getting close meant death. The house itself radiated malevolence that exceeded mere atmospheric horror. The structure existed simultaneously in both dimensions, a thin place where the barrier between worlds had worn transparent through decades of tragedy. They entered through the front door, which opened without resistance, as though the house welcomed them to their doom. The interior matched the real Creel house but existed in advanced decay, furniture collapsed and walls compromised by vine growth that suggested conscious movement. The attic stairs loomed before them, each step potentially their last. They climbed in formation, Nancy leading with the shotgun, Steve and Robin following with their respective weapons ready. The wood creaked beneath their weight, sounds that might alert their target but which could not be avoided. The ascent seemed to take hours, though, in reality, perhaps a minute passed between beginning and arrival at the attic door. Nancy pushed it open, revealing the space beyond and the horror waiting within. Vecna's physical body hung suspended in the attic's centre, supported by vines that connected him to the house and through it to the entire Upside Down. His form, grotesque beyond what they had been prepared for, despite descriptions, demonstrated the complete corruption that had transformed Henry Creel into this monster. The vines that penetrated his flesh pulsed with rhythm that suggested breathing or heartbeat. The boundary between creature and dimension blurred to the point of meaninglessness. He remained in his trance state, his consciousness battling 11 and attacking Max, unaware of the physical threat, entering his sanctuary. Nancy fired first, the shotgun's blast deafening in the enclosed space. The shot struck Vecna's chest, tearing flesh and creating wounds that would have killed any normal creature instantly. He did not die. His body jerked from the impact, the trance state disrupted, consciousness returning to assess the new threat. His eyes opened, regarding them with recognition and something approaching amusement. They had hoped to kill him while he remained vulnerable in trance. Instead, they had merely announced their presence and triggered defenses they were not prepared to face. The vines throughout the attic animated, transforming from structural elements to weapons in seconds. They lashed out at the three intruders, seeking to capture or crush or simply drive them away from their protected core. Steve's Molotov cocktails proved immediately effective, the fire racing along vines with satisfying speed, forcing them to retract or be consumed. Nancy fired again, her second shot striking Vecna's shoulder and spinning him in his suspended position. Robin thrust with her spear, finding exposed flesh and drawing what passed for blood in a creature more dimension than human. Vecna's response, once he oriented to the situation, demonstrated power that exceeded anything they had faced previously. His psychic abilities, which worked on minds at distance, proved equally effective on bodies at proximity. Steve found himself lifted and thrown against the wall with force that drove air from his lungs. Robin's spear was torn from her hands, turned against her, forcing desperate dodging to avoid impalement by her own weapon. Nancy, positioned furthest from him, maintained her assault with the shotgun, each blast buying seconds for the others to recover. The battle devolved into desperate improvisation. Their plan, such as it had been, dissolved into survival instinct and stubborn refusal to retreat. Steve's Molotov cocktails created enough fire to force Vecna away from one section of the attic, though the flame's effectiveness against his flesh proved disappointingly limited. Nancy exhausted her shotgun shells, switched to the handgun she carried as backup, found its smaller caliber even less effective. Robin, weaponless after her spear was destroyed, contributed by setting additional fires and attempting to sever the vines, connecting Vecna to his support structure. The decisive moment came when Nancy, positioning herself at point-blank range, with full knowledge that proximity invited death, emptied her handgun into Vecna's torso. The accumulated damage, combined with the fires burning throughout the attic and the psychic battle he was simultaneously fighting against 11, finally exceeded his ability to maintain physical coherence. His body fell from its suspension, crashing through the attic floor to the level below. Steve followed with his final Molotov cocktail, the bottle striking Vecna's falling form and engulfing him in flames. They watched him burn, tumbling through the house's rotted structure to land in an inferno of their creation. The vines retracted. The house's malevolent atmosphere dissipated somewhat. Steve, Nancy, and Robin, battered and exhausted, allowed themselves brief hope that they had succeeded. They moved to confirm the kill, approaching the hole in the floor through which Vecna had fallen, expecting to find nothing but burned corpse. What they found instead was absence. No body, no ash, no evidence that anything had burned there. Vecna had disappeared. His survival beyond doubt, but his location unknown. They had wounded him severely, possibly mortally, but they had not witnessed death, and therefore could not confirm victory. In the Creel house in Real Hawkins, Max floated above the floor of the living room, where her body had been sitting. Lucas, watching in horror, saw her limbs begin to twist at impossible angles, the breaking of bones audible even across the space separating them. Her eyes bled, the curse progressing toward its conclusion. His hand scrambled for the Walkman, pressing play with fumbling desperation. Running up that hill began immediately, the opening notes carrying into Max's consciousness, despite the distance that had opened between her mind and body. The song reached her in Vecna's mindscape, interrupting his psychological assault with memories that he could not corrupt. The music represented not just sound, but connection, not just melody, but meaning. Every time she had listened to this song, every moment it had accompanied, came flooding back with force that countered his darkness with her own light. The memories showed her Lucas's patience, despite her pushing him away. Dustin's loyalty when she had offered him nothing. Steve's protective presence, asking for nothing in return. The friendship she had tried to reject, but which had persisted despite her efforts. Vecna's grip loosened, not broken but weakened by the song's interference and 11's simultaneous assault. Max's consciousness pulled back toward her body, the tether between mind and flesh reasserting itself. The curse's progression slowed, her bones ceasing their breaking, though damage had already been done. Her eyes, already destroyed by the early stages of the attack, would not recover, but her life remained. She fell from her levitation. Lucas, catching her before impact with the floor, could add to her injuries. Her whispered words, barely audible through the trauma and pain, told him she was still here. The phrase carried multiple meanings beyond simple confirmation of survival. She had been absent emotionally for months, isolating herself from everyone who cared. Now, broken and blind, she was present in ways she had not been since Billy's death. The suffering had brought her back to connection, rather than driving her further into isolation. Lucas held her carefully, mindful of her broken limbs, and wept with relief that she lived despite the horrible cost. Max's heart stopped. The medical reality, which would later be documented in hospital records, showed clinical death lasting over 1 minute. Her brain, deprived of oxygen, began the cascade of cellular death that would lead to permanent damage if not reversed immediately. Lucas, feeling her go limp in his arms, her breathing ceasing and pulse vanishing, screamed for help that no one could provide. Erica, monitoring from the basement, heard her brother's anguish, but could not comprehend what was happening. The curse had claimed its fourth victim, even if only for a minute, even if Eleven's intervention had prevented the full duration Vecna normally required. In Nevada, 11 felt Max die. The connection between them, maintained through 11's projection across distance, allowed her to perceive the moment consciousness left Max's body. The finality of it, the absolute cessation that death represented, should have meant the end. 11 refused to accept this conclusion. She'd spent her childhood and adolescence being told what was possible and impossible, which rules could not be broken and which barriers could not be crossed. She had exceeded every limitation placed on her, had achieved things Brenner claimed were beyond any psychic's ability. This moment demanded she exceed again. The power she summoned came from places she had not accessed even at her peak. She reached into death itself, into the space between living and dead, where Max's consciousness drifted without anchor. She seized that consciousness with psychic force that paid no attention to what should have been possible. She pulled Max back from death through sheer refusal to accept loss. The expenditure required every reserve of power she had recovered, depleting her completely, but the effect was undeniable. Max's heart restarted. Lucas felt the pulse return beneath his fingers, weak and irregular, but present. Max's breathing resumed, shallow and laboured, but sufficient. Her eyes remained sightless, blood still flowing from the ruined sockets. Her limbs hung at angles that indicated multiple fractures. Her consciousness, when it flickered back into awareness, seemed uncertain whether it inhabited life or afterlife, but she lived. Despite Vecna's curse, despite clinical death, despite all the forces arrayed against her, Max Mayfield remained in the world. The fourth death, however brief its duration, had occurred. Vecna's ritual, requiring 4 victims to open his gates, recognized the minute of Max's death as sufficient to trigger the spell. The ground beneath Hawkins began to split, fault lines racing outward from the Creel house in 4 directions. The gates tore through town from their central nexus, creating an X pattern of destruction that shattered infrastructure and collapsed buildings. The earthquake explanation, which government officials would later employ to describe the event, captured none of the reality. These were not natural geological shifts, but dimensional barriers failing, the upside down beginning to bleed through into the living world. Erica and Lucas, feeling the house shake around them, recognized they needed to evacuate immediately. Lucas lifted Max with care impossible given the circumstances, driven by adrenaline and determination to get her to safety, regardless of his own injuries. They fled the Creel house as it collapsed, the structure unable to withstand the tearing of dimensions it had facilitated. The street outside showed devastation, the 4 gates visible as glowing fissures extending to the horizon in cardinal directions. Buildings burned, power lines sparked, screams echoed from locations near the gates where people had been caught in the initial collapse. Steve, Nancy, and Robin, trapped in the upside down as the gates opened, found their escape route through the water gate compromised by structural changes to the dimension. The familiar paths through the decayed town no longer led where they expected, as though the upside down's geography had shifted in response to the gate's opening. They navigated by instinct and desperation, eventually finding their way back to the lake and through the gate to the real world. They emerged exhausted and uncertain whether their assault had succeeded or failed, finding a Hawkins transformed by the battle they had fought. Dustin Henderson emerged from the upside down, alone, carrying Eddie's guitar and the knowledge of Eddie's sacrifice. His grief, too large to process immediately, manifested as numbness that would later transform into guilt and rage and sorrow. For now, he simply moved through the destroyed town toward the hospital, where he knew the others would gather, Eddie's guitar case held against his chest, like a coffin he refused to bury. In the upside down, Vecna's body regenerated in a hidden location far from the Creel house. His injuries, severe enough to have killed any normal creature multiple times over, required time to heal, but would not prove fatal. His plan had partially succeeded. The gate stood open, 4 tiers through which his influence could spread. The merge between dimensions had begun, though more slowly than he had hoped. His defeat of Max had been prevented at the last moment, denying him the complete victory he sought. But he lived, and living meant he could continue his work. The war was not won, but neither was it lost. Time would determine which side had truly prevailed. In Russia, the prison escape reached its conclusion during the same hours that Hawkins battled for survival. The Demogorgon, weakened by Vecna's distraction and injury, became manageable in ways it had not been at full strength. Hopper, Joyce, Murray and Dimitri fought the creature with weapons scavenged from the guard armory and determination born of having no alternative to victory. The battle was brutal, the creature's diminished state still leaving it capable of killing any of them instantly if they made mistakes. But fire applied systematically and without sole mercy eventually overwhelmed even this monster's resistance. Yuri, motivated by the chaos and the promise of payment he could now collect by delivering the Americans to safety rather than captivity, provided the airplane that carried them from Siberia toward Alaska. The journey would take days, with stops at remote locations where questions would not be asked and bribes would be accepted. Joyce and Hopper, reunited after months of believing each other dead or lost, sat together in the plane's cargo area and processed emotions that neither could properly articulate. Murray, exhausted beyond measure, slept despite the plane's noise and uncomfortable conditions. They had survived, had escaped, had defeated their immediate threats. The broader context, the battle in Hawkins they knew nothing about, remained unknown until they could reach communication facilities in Alaska days later. The battles across 3 locations concluded not with clear victory, but with survival. Max lived but would face recovery from injuries that would leave her blind and broken. Eddie died a hero known only to those present. 11 had saved Max, but depleted herself completely in the process. Steve, Nancy and Robin had wounded but not killed Vecna. The gate stood open, the upside down spreading slowly but inexorably into Hawkins. The sacrifice had been devastating. Yet in that sacrifice lay testament to the power of ordinary courage against extraordinary evil. The war was not won, but neither was it lost. Morning would come to Hawkins, bringing both the costs of the night's battle and the opportunity to continue fighting. The balance between victory and defeat would be determined by what happened next, by whether the survivors could rebuild and prepare for the conflict that still awaited them. The days following the earthquake, as officials termed it, brought both reunion and reckoning. Hawkins transformed from battleground to disaster zone, with those who knew the truth unable to speak it, bearing silent witness to devastation they had tried to prevent. Monday, March 29th dawned over a town split by 4 massive fissures, forming an X through its centre. Buildings collapsed along the fault lines, and a population struggling to comprehend what natural disaster could create such geometric precision in its destruction. Hawkins Memorial Hospital, already understaffed and undersupplied, became the focal point for a community's trauma. The emergency room overflowed within hours of the earthquake, the injured arriving faster than medical personnel could triage. Max Mayfield occupied a bed in the intensive care unit, her condition listed as critical but stable, terms that communicated severity while offering minimal hope. The medical assessment of her injuries revealed damage that exceeded what most trauma surgeons encountered in entire careers. Both legs fractured in multiple locations, her left arm broken in 3 places, her right wrist shattered. The internal injuries, while less visible, posed equal dangers as doctors monitored for organ damage from the force her body had sustained. Her eyes, however, represented the injury that would define her recovery. The ophthalmologist's examination confirmed complete bilateral optic nerve destruction. The bleeding Lucas had witnessed during her ordeal came from catastrophic damage to the structures responsible for sight. Medical technology offered no solution, no surgery that could restore what had been destroyed through means no doctor could explain. The chart notation described the injury as consistent with extreme trauma, though the mechanism remained unclear given the absence of external wounds beyond the bleeding itself. Max would be blind permanently and completely, assuming she woke from the coma that currently protected her from understanding what had been lost. The coma itself created the deepest concern among her medical team. Her brain activity showed patterns that defied standard categorization. She was not brain dead. The scans demonstrated clear neural activity, but neither was she simply unconscious in the conventional sense. The neurologist consulted on her case noted that her brain's electrical patterns suggested someone in deep REM sleep rather than traumatic coma. Her eyes, despite their destroyed state, moved beneath closed lids as though she were dreaming. The medical mystery of her condition would remain unresolved throughout her hospitalization. Lucas maintained vigil at her bedside despite his own injuries requiring treatment. His exhaustion, both physical and emotional, had reached levels that worried the nurses who checked on him regularly. They brought him food he did not eat, suggested rest he would not take, offered counselling he refused. His hand remained in Max's, his presence the only constant in her isolated, unconscious existence. He spoke to her constantly, telling her about the hospital, about their friends who visited, about the town's recovery efforts. Whether she heard him remained unknown, but speaking provided him purpose when helplessness threatened to overwhelm. 11 visited when her own recovery allowed, her complete depletion of power having left her weak and fevered for days after the battle. She sat beside Max's bed, attempting to sense the consciousness she'd pulled back from death. What she found disturbed her more than absence would have. Max existed somewhere between life and death, not fully committed to either state. Her consciousness, damaged by its brief period of cessation and Vecna's psychological assault, had retreated to a place even 11's abilities could not easily reach. The connection between them persisted, allowing 11 to confirm Max's continued existence, but communication remained impossible across the gulf separating them. The doctor's prognosis offered little beyond uncertainty. If Max woke, the timeline remained unpredictable. Days, weeks, months, or never, all represented possibilities supported by her unusual presentation. If she woke, the physical rehabilitation would require years. Learning to navigate blindness while healing from multiple fractures would challenge even patients with intact mental function. The psychological trauma, both from the physical injuries and from whatever experience preceded them, would require extensive support. The uncertainty created a waiting period that tested everyone who cared about her. Eddie Munson's death remained unknown to Hawkins, beyond the small group who had witnessed or learned of his sacrifice. His body, left in the Upside Down during the chaos of escape, could not be recovered for burial or evidence. The official investigation into Chrissy Cunningham and Fred Benson's murders continued with Eddie as the primary suspect. His disappearance during the earthquake treated as either death by natural disaster or flight from justice. The town's assumption of his guilt, reinforced by the satanic panic atmosphere and his absence to defend himself, solidified into accepted fact. Wayne Munson mourned alone in the trailer park that had been damaged but not destroyed by the earthquake. His nephew, the boy he had raised, the person he knew better than anyone, would be remembered by history as a murderer. The injustice of it, the knowledge that Eddie had died heroically while being vilified as a monster, created a bitterness that threatened to consume him. The only comfort came from an unexpected visit by Dustin Henderson, who arrived at Wayne's trailer 2 days after the earthquake with Eddie's guitar and the truth. Dustin's account of Eddie's final hours, delivered while fighting through grief that made speech difficult, gave Wayne something the official narrative never could. He learned that Eddie had been innocent of all charges, that he had fought to protect others, that his last act had been cutting the rope to prevent monsters from reaching Hawkins, that he had died bravely after a lifetime of believing himself a coward. Wayne wept while Dustin spoke, his tears mixing grief with pride and rage that such sacrifice would go unrecognized. He accepted Eddie's guitar with the reverence appropriate to a relic, the instrument representing all that remained of the boy who had been his son in everything but blood. The campaign to clear Eddie's name began immediately, though its prospects appeared dim. Wayne contacted lawyers who explained the challenges of proving innocence for someone who could not testify and whose death could not even be officially confirmed. The physical evidence from the crime scenes, while not actually implicating Eddie, had been interpreted in ways that supported the prevailing narrative. Changing that narrative would require either finding the true culprit, impossible given Vecna's nature, or demonstrating Eddie's location elsewhere during the murders, equally impossible given his flight and subsequent hiding. The legal battle would be long, expensive, and likely unsuccessful. Dustin's guilt over cutting the rope, over surviving when Eddie had not, manifested in obsessive dedication to clearing his friend's name. He gathered testimony from everyone who had interacted with Eddie during the relevant period, documented his whereabouts, constructed timelines that proved nothing to those unwilling to reconsider their conclusions, but which provided Dustin with purpose when grief threatened paralysis. Steve helped with this effort, his own survivor's guilt finding outlet in supporting Dustin's mission. Together, they worked to ensure that at least some people would know the truth, even if official recognition remained beyond reach. The guitar, displayed in Wayne's trailer, where Eddie's other possessions remained untouched, became a memorial to sacrifice that most would never understand. Dustin visited it regularly, sitting in Eddie's room, telling stories to the absent friend who would never hear them. The ritual provided comfort that therapy could not, maintaining connection across the boundary death had imposed. Wayne appreciated these visits, the evidence that at least one person beyond himself had truly known and valued Eddie. The town's response to the earthquake revealed divisions that had existed beneath the surface for years. The disaster, killing 38 people and leaving hundreds homeless, demanded both immediate emergency response and long-term reconstruction planning. The Federal Emergency Management Agency arrived within 48 hours, establishing a command center at the high school and beginning damage assessment. The Red Cross opened shelters for displaced residents, the gymnasium becoming a temporary housing facility that accommodated families whose homes had been destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. The official explanation, a 7.4 magnitude earthquake with an epicenter beneath Hawkins, satisfied most residents despite the geological improbability. Indiana experienced earthquakes rarely, and never of this magnitude. The peculiar pattern of the fissures, forming a precise X rather than following fault lines, should have raised questions that it largely did not. People accepted the narrative because the alternative, acknowledging something supernatural, required abandoning worldviews they had constructed over lifetimes. The few who suggested other explanations were dismissed as conspiracy theorists or attention seekers. The government's response included investigation into possible causes beyond natural geological activity. The Department of Energy, which had overseen Hawkins National Laboratory before its closure, sent teams to assess whether any underground facilities or experiments might have contributed to the seismic event. These investigations, conducted without public announcement, focused on the old lab site and the areas beneath town where tunnel systems had been discovered years earlier. The findings, classified immediately upon completion, never entered public discourse. The community divided roughly into 3 groups based on response to the crisis. The first group, comprising perhaps 60% of residents, chose evacuation. Families packed essentials and left for relatives' homes in other cities. Corporate transfers requested immediate activation, and anyone with means to establish life elsewhere did so. The exodus occurred over days and weeks, a slow hemorrhaging of population that left Hawkins increasingly empty. The second group, maybe 30%, remained but advocated for abandonment of reconstruction efforts. They attended town council meetings, arguing that Hawkins should be officially closed, that the government should facilitate complete relocation, that returning to normal was impossible given the scale of destruction. The final 10%, stubborn or faithful, or simply without alternatives, committed to rebuilding despite the odds. Jason Carver's death during the earthquake, occurring in the Creel house, where he had pursued Lucas, removed the most vocal leader of the Satanic Panic movement. His passing, mourned by his team and family, paradoxically reduced tensions around Eddie's case. Without Jason's charismatic certainty driving the vigilante impulse, the basketball team's investigation into Hellfire Club dissolved into individual grief rather than collective action. Several team members, Patrick McKinney among them, had died in the earthquake, their deaths attributed to being in wrong places when the ground split. The survivors dealt with trauma through various means, none of which included continuing Jason's crusade. The town council meetings, held weekly to address reconstruction decisions, revealed the depth of disagreement about Hawkins' future. The mayor, attempting to project optimism while acknowledging legitimate concerns, proposed a phased rebuilding plan that would restore essential infrastructure before addressing residential areas. This plan, requiring years and massive federal investment, depended on convincing enough residents to return that the effort would be justified. The debates grew heated as different factions argued their positions, the emotional stakes precluding rational discussion. Mike Wheeler, Will Byers, Jonathan Byers, and Argyle arrived from California on Tuesday evening, their cross-country drive in the Surfer Boy pizza van having taken days. Mike's reunion with his family, particularly his sister Nancy, carried emotions neither had language to express. Nancy's experience in the Upside Down, fighting Vecna directly, had changed her in ways Mike could perceive, even without knowing details. His own journey, helping Eleven recover her powers and supporting her through the psychic battle, had similarly matured him beyond his years. They spoke briefly about what each had experienced, acknowledging shared trauma without fully processing it yet. Will's return to Hawkins, the town he had left to escape memories of his possession, and the Upside Down's violation brought complicated feelings he had not anticipated. The earthquake's destruction made the town almost unrecognizable. Familiar landmarks collapsed or damaged beyond repair. However, the sensation of coming home, of being back where his closest friends existed, provided comfort despite the circumstances. His connection to the Upside Down, never fully severed after his time there, made him uniquely aware of the ongoing danger that most residents remained ignorant about. Jonathan reunited with Nancy in the hospital where both had come to visit Max. Their relationship, strained by distance and diverging life paths, found temporary reprieve in shared crisis. They held each other without speaking about what came next, the immediate necessities precluding conversations about futures that might not include being together. The understanding passed between them wordlessly, that what they had been might not survive into what they would become, but that love persisted even when relationships evolved beyond romantic forms. Argyle, the most unlikely member of their group, provided levity through observations that somehow captured truth, despite their superficial absurdity. His friendship with Jonathan, forged in California's more relaxed environment, brought a perspective uncorrupted by years of trauma. His acceptance of the fantastic, treating interdimensional battles and psychic powers as interesting rather than impossible, made him easy company when everyone else carried weight that threatened to crush them. His suggestion that they were all experiencing collective consciousness expansion met eye rolls, but also relieved some tension through its earnest ridiculousness. Eleven's reunion with Hopper, which would occur days later, when Joyce and her group finally made their way back from Russia, brought emotions too large for immediate processing. The days between the battle and their arrival crawled by with agonizing slowness, each update on their progress creating relief that they lived mixed with impatience for their actual presence. Joyce's confirmation that Hopper had survived, that her instinct to go to Russia had been correct, vindicated choices that had seemed irrational to many who knew about them. The groups gathering at the hospital, with Max's coma creating a focal point for their vigil, allowed for sharing of experiences across the 3 separate battles they had fought. Steve, Nancy, and Robin described the assault on Vecna in the Upside Down. Dustin recounted Eddie's sacrifice with grief that made speaking difficult. Lucas explained Max's final moments before her heart stopped. 11 detailed her psychic battle and the desperate act of pulling Max back from death. Each story added pieces to a larger picture that remained incomplete, the full scope of what had occurred too vast for anyone to hold entirely in mind. Will's awareness of ongoing danger grew as days passed. The back of his neck, the location where he had always sensed the mind flayers' presence, began prickling with familiar warning. The sensation, which had been absent since the Battle of Starcourt, returned with intensity that increased daily. His attempts to explain what he sensed met with understanding from those who had experienced similar connections, but the group's exhaustion and focus on immediate crises prevented adequate response to warnings about future threats. Will persisted despite this, knowing that his connection to the Upside Down, while unwanted, provided intelligence they would need. Mike noticed Will's distress, their friendship allowing communication beyond words. The conversations they had, often while walking through Hawkins' damaged streets, touched on Will's fears about being used again as a conduit for the Mind Flayer. Mike's reassurance that they would prevent that outcome regardless of what it required provided comfort, even as both understood that promises might not be sufficient against forces they barely comprehended. The bond between them, forged in childhood and strengthened through shared trauma, had evolved into something approaching the telepathy they sometimes wished they possessed. The revelation of what Will sensed came during a group meeting at the hospital, everyone except Max present to discuss what came next. Will's explanation that the Upside Down's presence remained active, that Vecna survived despite their assault, that the Mind Flayer lurked as always, shattered any hope that the battle had ended conclusively. The news, delivered with apologetic certainty by someone who wished desperately to be wrong, forced acknowledgement that their respite would be temporary. The war continued, and they remained the only ones positioned to fight it. The drive to view Hawkins from the hilltop overlooking town occurred on Thursday afternoon, a week after the earthquake. The entire group, needing to see the full scope of what had happened, made the journey together. From elevation, the 4 gates appeared as glowing fissures extending from a central point, their X pattern unmistakable. The destruction along each fault line created corridors of collapsed buildings and damaged infrastructure. However, these physical changes, devastating as they appeared, represented only the surface of the transformation Hawkins had undergone. The ash falling like snow, drifting down from a sky that should have been clear, caught their attention immediately. The particles, finer than any natural ash and carrying a faint iridescence, coated surfaces with residue that resisted ordinary cleaning. The substance, clearly originating from the Upside Down, represented the dimension's initial intrusion into the physical world. Plants near the fissures withered despite the spring season, their leaves turning brown and brittle as though winter had returned to claim them specifically. The decay spread slowly outward from the gates, creating zones of death that expanded at rates measured in feet per day, but which showed no signs of stopping. The sky itself had changed, particularly visible at sunset. The clouds took on a reddish tinge that had not existed before the earthquake, the colour reminiscent of the Upside Down's perpetual storm. The effect was subtle, easily dismissed as atmospheric conditions or light pollution, but those who knew what to look for recognised it immediately. The barrier between dimensions had not merely been breached but was actively dissolving. The merge Vecna had intended proceeding, despite his defeat. The particles floating in the air near the fissures, visible when sunlight caught them at correct angles, created an effect like snow globes being shaken. These spores or seeds or whatever they represented drifted on air currents, spreading beyond the immediate vicinity of the gates. Their purpose remained unknown, but their origin clearly traced to the Upside Down. The government teams investigating the earthquake collected samples, their findings classified but presumably alarming given the increased security presence around the fissure sites. Vines resembling those that filled the Upside Down, but existing in the real world, began growing from the fissures after the first week. They emerged at night, spreading across ground with speed that suggested more than natural growth. By morning, they would retract or wither when exposed to full sunlight, but each night they pushed further from the gates. The pattern suggested that given time, given the weakening of barriers that the gates represented, these vines would eventually persist, even in daylight, claiming territory that currently remained in the living world. The group's observation from the hilltop brought home the reality that their victory had been incomplete. They had prevented immediate catastrophe, had saved Max's life at tremendous cost, had wounded Vecna severely, but they had not closed the gates or stopped the merge. The Upside Down was spreading, slowly enough that most people did not notice the changes day to day, but inexorably enough that the eventual outcome seemed certain without intervention. The question became not whether to continue fighting, but how to fight when they were already exhausted and diminished. The season concluded not with closure, but with awareness that the story remained unfinished. Vecna lived, weakened but recovering. The Upside Down spread, slowly but steadily. Max existed in liminal space between life and death. Her consciousness, trapped or hiding in places even 11 could not reach. Eddie died a hero known only to those present, his reputation destroyed by accusations he could not refute. Hawkins stood fractured, both physically and communally, uncertain whether to rebuild or abandon what remained. Yet in gathering darkness, the group remained together, scarred but unbroken, preparing for battles yet to come. The understanding that more would be required, that their struggle had been not conclusion, but prelude, settled over them with weight that somehow felt lighter for being shared. They had survived. That alone represented victory of a sort, testament to the resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary evil. The work ahead would test them further, would demand more sacrifices, would offer no guarantees of ultimate triumph. But standing together on that hilltop, watching their broken town while toxic particles from another dimension fell like malevolent snow, they remained committed to continuing. The war was not won, but neither had they surrendered. Morning would come again to Hawkins, and with it, another opportunity to fight, to hope, to refuse the darkness's claim that all struggles eventually ended in defeat. And so our journey through the events of spring 1986 concludes where it began, with a small town in Indiana, forever changed by the extraordinary courage of those who call it home. The story is not finished. Darkness still lingers, battles still wait, futures still hang uncertain. Max sleeps in her hospital bed, her fate unknown. Vecna heals in the shadows, planning his return. The Upside Down spread slowly through Hawkins, claiming territory one withered plant at a time. Yet tonight, as you rest, remember that the power to face darkness comes not from being unafraid, but from standing together despite fear. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May your sleep be filled with the sound of Kate Bush on a Walkman, the courage of small-town heroes, the loyalty of friends who never stop fighting, and the gentle knowledge that even in darkness, someone is always reaching back to help you home. Rest well, knowing that morning always comes, even to Hawkins.